So here's our basic outline of how we're going to break this down. We're going to start with some introductory stuff, kind of grounding us with where we are and what we're going to talk about with this workshop. And we're going to start with garden installation. After the garden is installed, really the first year, year and a half of garden care after your garden is installed is called the establishment period. And that's a critical time where the plants need a little bit more care, a little bit more attention, definitely a bit more water to get going. And so we'll talk about that. And then we will talk a bit about ongoing care. We have another workshop that focuses on that. So that's kind of the bonus section at the end. Really, we're focused on installation and establishment, want to make sure we have plenty of time to answer questions. And then we'll cover as much of that ongoing care as we can. And I'll point you to other resources for everything you need to know about that. And then through all this, I always like to remind ourselves that a garden is never truly done. A garden is not like redesigning your living room and buying a new rug and a new couch, where as long as you don't spill things on it and the cat doesn't shred it, it's going to last a long time and should ideally stay exactly how it is when you put it there. A garden is a living system that's always evolving. And so even if you do everything perfect during the establishment phase, you're going to lose a couple of plants. That'll be a good time to scratch your head, maybe try something different. And that makes the whole thing really a lot of fun as well. And I always encourage people to think about the fact that you are kind of in the mix with this literally living, breathing, evolving garden space as something that makes it interesting and fun and not a source of frustration. So that's kind of the lens that we are going to look at it through. And so the first thing we're going to do is talk about kind of where we are in the general order of things. This is one of the first questions that I often get from people thinking about this is, how do I even take this on? How should I even structure taking on a garden project? Well, there's no one way to do it, but here is a general outline, and then you can kind of make it work for yourself from there. And I was so excited to jump into this with you all. I am just remembering that I forgot to tell you how to interact and how to ask questions with me today. I see that there is one hand raised. So because we have a pretty large group with us, I don't normally call on people who have their hands raised because there's a lot of up and down time, especially downtime with the audio and technical issues. So the best way to interact and ask questions, and I encourage you to ask questions, is to do that through the Q&A function that you will see in your Zoom interface. So there's going to be a panel with all sorts of little buttons. And if you hover your mouse over and click the one that says Q&A and has a couple of little text bubbles, that will launch something where you can type your question. Feel free to type your questions in at any time. I have those displayed on my screen, and I kind of keep an eye on what questions are coming in as I am doing the workshop. And so what I will normally do to kind of keep the flow going is I will stop in between sections as I see questions come in, and then I will kind of catch up and answer questions. Because we have a pretty decent sized group, the questions that I will answer will be the ones that are more generally about what we've just talked about, whose answers will be probably of interest to multiple people here. If you have really more specific questions about, well, like, here's my exact situation, how do I deal with that? I'm happy to stay until after the end of the class and past noon to answer all or as many of those as I can, but I might need to hold some of those until the end. So if you type your questions into the Q&A section, that really helps me keep things organized and make sure that they're not missed. If you have general comments, you can type those into the chat section, which is another button you can press. But I encourage you to type your questions into the Q&A because sometimes they're easy to miss when they go into the chat, depending on how active the chat is. And so with that, we will jump into it. So here is the general order of things. Before you think about installing your garden, before you go out and buy plants, you're going to want to take a step back if you're buying, if you're going to be buying more than a few plants, if you're really kind of redoing a whole section of your garden or a whole front yard or backyard, especially. But even if it's just a single kind of planter area, it's always good to take a step back and think about what your goals are for the project. Do you just want something pretty and low maintenance? Are you trying to have a garden that provides for butterflies and hummingbirds, maybe? Whatever your goals are. Do you need more privacy? Create that list. Then go out and look at your area in context of that list, think about your budget, and then with all of that in mind, come up with a design. We're not really going to talk about design today, so we're talking installation and maintenance, and that's a whole class. We have a number of other classes just about design, and I will show you on the next slide our YouTube page where you can get all of our design classes. So definitely think about your design first. If you're going to be working with contractors, then you talk to contractors and get quotes once you have your design. Most of you are probably thinking about DIY projects. That's why you're interested in the installation and establishment process. So it's great. I like working with both groups of people. It's really fun to work with DIYers though. So next, if you are in Southern California and you are applying for the turf replacement rebate, you need to do your application before you start taking out your turf. That's the rebates available through SoCalWatersmart.com, where if you meet the requirements for most of Southern California, you can, after you get your approval, after you do your project, after you put your landscape in and provide proof of that, you can get $2 to $3, depending on where you are, per square foot of turf removed for a landscape that goes in and meets all of the requirements. There's quite a few requirements. And so that would be kind of the next thing, is make sure you apply. And if you're thinking about that, remember that that is a rebate, not just to put in a nice Waterwise garden, but it's a rebate to remove turf. Can be turf that's brown and hasn't been watered, but the turf needs to be there. It can't be weeds, can't be down to dirt already, can't be shrubbery. After that, if you have turf, you're going to want to kill your turf, kill it good. This is your time before you put your plants in to make sure that that turf is dead. If you have Bermuda grass, and a lot of people do, we'll talk a little bit about Bermuda grass later, in Southern California, it's a survivor. So it can take a couple of months to kill your turf, and you really want to do that. You don't want to have that stuff start to grow back all around your new and get tangled up in the root system of your new established garden. The extra work you do at this phase will more than pay itself off. And then whether or not you're killing turf, then you get your site prepared. If you are digging down to capture water in a dry stream bed or something, moving that extra soil to create some mounds or some landscape, doing terraces, anything like that, you do that generally next. If you are killing turf, for most of us, because in Southern California, most of us do have some Bermuda grass, ideally that's done in summer. It's not a hard, fast rule, but ideally that's done in summer. We are kind of in the peak planting season right now, but it's already getting a little cool for perfect control of Bermuda grass because it starts to go dormant in the cooler weather. So that's something we think about. If you haven't thought about design yet, if you're doing a large project where you do have turf with Bermuda grass, it might be worth considering doing your design, doing your prep and killing turf next summer, and then being ready to plant next fall, October, November. However, it's up to you. I've been in that same situation and I've just kind of gone for it. And I've just known that I'm going to have to do extra weeding when the next summer comes around. So whatever's going to work best for you. Following that, you're going to be doing your primary irrigation system work. If you need to be running any irrigation lines, trenching, changing sprinklers around, or even capping off your irrigation system and then just watering with like a hose attached sprinkler for a California native garden, that's not going to have to be watered that often. Figuring that out, doing most of that work is going to be the next phase. You want to have that ready before you do your planting so that your plants can start benefiting from that irrigation system, whatever your approach is going to be right away. Then you do your planting. That's best going to be done in Southern California, late fall to early winter. Normally I tell people think Thanksgiving through the new year. However, even now, it's definitely starting to cool off. And even on the days where it is pretty hot, the days are so much shorter than in kind of midsummer that it really does make a difference. By planting in the fall, what happens is some plants are going to take off right away. Some plants you're not going to see that much growth on, but they're going to be rooting in underneath the ground, starting to get established. And so when the heat really comes around next mid-spring, they're going to be ready to grow, but they're going to have a root system to support that top growth. And then if we get an early heat wave, they're going to be much more ready to deal with that and actually thrive in that situation potentially than if we planted in spring. Now, we can't always hit the ideal project period, but I encourage people, if at all possible, to be planted by the end of March. Especially if you're doing this kind of as a first timer, late fall to early winter, through February, kind of fine, but definitely by the end of early March, if at all possible. It is technically possible to get these plants established during the summer, but for most DIYers, you need to pay so much more attention. The situation can get so much more fussy between making sure you don't overwater, but not wanting to underwater, that it's definitely easiest to do it fall through early winter. Then finally, depending on your irrigation system, if you're working with the drip system, sometimes the final last drip lines will be done immediately after planting, like, the same weekend, the next weekend at the latest. And then you're moving into mulching, cleaning up, and kind of final touches, followed by that establishment care as you enjoy watching your garden grow in. And so we are going to hit on multiple of these topics today. Some of them, like the site preparation, the planting, we are going to spend a lot of time on. Some of them we're just going to briefly touch on, like irrigation, because we have entire other classes that are really the depth of information you need to know everything you need to know about that process. And so when I mentioned the other classes that we are teaching, we are kind of midway through the flow of our fall through winter sequence of classes that we teach from the Waterwise Community Center. We always start earlier in the season, late summer, with thinking about design. And then we move through irrigation systems. So we've already taught our retrofitting lawn sprinklers for Waterwise and Native Gardens class. And then as it's getting to be planting time, we talk installation and establishment. So if you're just starting to think about this, our YouTube channel has our recordings of all those past workshops, or at least one version of them. Usually it's kind of like our favorite one. So if you go to cbwcd.org/YouTube, that'll automatically bring you to our YouTube channel where you can get those past recordings. So again, if you're just thinking about it now, you're probably going to want to check out our California Native Garden Design online workshop. If you have turf to remove, check out our Removing Your Lawn the Right Way workshop. If you have a turf sprinkler system and you're going to be adapting it or wanting to know your options and you're going to be really doing it yourself, or really want to know to direct a contractor about what option you want, check out our Removing Lawn Sprinklers for Waterwise and California Native Gardens workshop. If you are going to be doing it yourself, there's also, you can find, if you go back to our main YouTube page, a whole playlist to support the retrofitting lawn sprinklers workshop, where we have kind of supplemental videos where you can follow my hand step by step as I show how to put together some of the things you're going to need to know how to put together. And then here we are going to be doing installation establishment. And then you also might want to either join us for the live workshop later in the winter or check out Rainwater Harvesting for home landscapes if you're thinking about integrating water capture, dry stream beds, things like that. And then finally, there's a whole bunch of other stuff, including other things about irrigation systems, as well as favorite plants for a local area and habitat gardening. So that's all on the YouTube page. And so now we're going to really start moving into these kind of topic specific sections. And so because there's that whole other class and playlist about irrigation systems, that's really, if you're going to be doing it yourself, some of you have maybe been in that already, what you want to check out. But I'm just going to go through the most important concepts quickly, because this is going to be important stuff to have thought about before you move into planting or other site work. So here's the basic challenge that is posed, is that even if you have a really good irrigation system for your lawn, most people we work with don't have a really good irrigation system for their lawn, but no matter what your lawn sprinkler system is, a lawn sprinkler system will normally pop up 2 or 4 inches, and that's fine for turf that gets mowed every week. But with your new beautiful multiple height plant, a tree, some shrubs, some perennial ground covers, garden, what's going to happen is your lawn sprinkler system will shoot directly into the closest plant. That plant will get way too much water. The rest of the areas will be too dry. So how do we deal with that? You have a few options. We're going to talk about 3 of them at a couple of points in time throughout the class. But if you want to continue to maintain an automatic irrigation system that you aren't going to have to kind of set up each time connected to a hose or hand water plants, which is an option if you want to have that much involvement with your garden. Most people we work with still want to have some sort of automatic irrigation system. You have a couple of options. The first one is that instead of having your sprinklers pop up and shoot directly into the closest plant, depending on your landscape design and the heights of your plant material, oftentimes the borders of a planted area around the edge of what used to be the lawn will be kind of lower ground cover material. And so you can take your sprinkler locations, maybe you need to move 1 or 2, and put your sprinklers on taller, solid, what are called risers, so a solid piece of irrigation piping. And then the sprinkler nozzles can be directly on there. You can also shift over to what's a higher efficiency type of nozzle that gets, has less mist, gets more of the water where it's supposed to go. That's called a high efficiency rotating sprinkler nozzle. So high efficiency rotating sprinkler nozzles on higher risers. And so as your landscape grows in, then you don't really end up, these are here, but you don't really end up seeing them. And everyone looks at the landscape, don't focus on them. And then actually we have in our front yard, this is my front yard, some of the songbirds actually like to perch on them when they're checking out the garden space before they go into it. So that's kind of cool to watch too. Over time, you might need to raise some of them up a little bit more. So you can see here as our front yard has grown in, very naturalistic native landscape, we've actually put some pop-up sprinklers on top of those pipes so that they're not really seen amongst some of the medium-sized plants when the sprinklers are off, but then they pop up and they shoot these individual sprays of water. Some go farther, some stay closer. And that gets a very even kind of spray pattern, much more efficient than traditional sprinklers. But that also depends on your landscape design. So for example, here we have a hedge that's growing in the back. And now that that's started to grow in, I am needing to move those over to the other side of the hedge because the hedge has started to block things. They're tough, Waterwise native plants. And so they'll still get plenty of water once these sprinklers are on the other side of the hedge. And if you're going to be doing that sort of work on a sprinkler system, as you prep for your planting, you can do all of that well before your planting so that it's ready to go kind of day one. Another option that you have, which is really the only other option that we recommend for if you want a in-ground irrigation system, if you're not going to be hand watering, is a drip irrigation grid. So this is different than what we see on residential systems, the most common drip systems that we see, which is there's a 1/2-inch tube, usually it's black, sometimes it's brown, and then they have little doodads popped onto them, or sometimes it has a smaller flexible black tube, and then individual little emitters or tiny sprays that go to each plant, 1 or 2 to each plant. In our program where we help homeowners with their irrigation systems, whenever we do a site visit to find breaks, those systems 100% of the time always have unidentified breaks and other issues. They're very fragile systems. They're quick and easy to put together, but they fall apart. And as the Waterwise or native plants grow in, they really want to spread their roots far and wide. They don't want all of that water concentrated right at the base. And so what you're supposed to do is add more of those individual emitters and move them farther away from the base over time. But almost nobody ever does that. And so what we recommend is a drip grid, and that's buying a drip line. This is how commercial drip irrigation systems are done because they're more resilient. They take a little bit more work and a little bit more cost to put in, but they're worth it because I've worked with some of these systems they go in well. Other than an occasional line break, which is rare, there'll be almost no maintenance for 7, 8, sometimes up to 10 years. So you buy the tube with the emitters already literally built inside, and normally it's at an even spacing, usually about 1 foot. And these are highly engineered things. So they're not just little holes. All the water, if they're installed well, comes out at the exact same rate. And depending on your soil type, the emitters you get, the spacing might be different. We break all of that down in the full retrofitting turf irrigation systems workshop. And essentially for a large garden space, and in the garden space this large, if the design worked, I'd probably be more likely to put the high efficiency sprinklers in. But in a large garden space, this is basically what you're doing. Is it's almost like it's rained through the whole eventual root zone of the plants. It's just not going through the top. And so it's even, and the plants can grow in their natural pattern. The roots want to go out and find water. In a small space like this, where it'd be pretty hard to have sprinklers that accurately water this and don't overspray onto the concrete and the asphalt, drip irrigation is usually the way to go. And if you have pathways or patio spaces, you can skip those areas and just put drip in the planting areas, but through the whole eventual root zone. And if you're doing a drip grid system, you want to either put the whole system in before planting, or sometimes people will have everything ready to go in terms of any underground pipe work, any adaptations, adapters. Sometimes you can cap off most of the old sprinklers and then put adapters on, so you don't need to do a lot of trenching or work underground, and then adapt your drip irrigation system. So you'll have all of that work done. You'll have maybe what's called your headers in, which are the lines that all of the emitter lines hook back into. But then sometimes you're not worried about all of this stuff. You'll plant, and then you'll run all these final lines and get them all attached right after planting. Depending on which approach you want to take, either way is fine. But make sure all of the first work, anything related to in-ground lines, anything related to adapters, all of that's done. So the most you would have to do is run those final drip lines. And then finally, depending on your site, depending on the shape of your site, how close it is to sidewalks, driveways, you do have an option of not having any permanent irrigation system and just really learning how to be in touch with how to hand water. Or this is an example for part of my backyard in my native garden, is we don't have any permanent irrigation system in the backyard other than for fruit trees and vegetable gardens. And in our native zones, most areas we just water about once a month in the months it doesn't rain. And that's either with a setup, which I'll show you later, connected to a hose on just a trickle at the base of the shrubs that need it, or in some wider areas, which at this point is really just this sunken native meadow area, which is part shade now. It's every 2 to 3 weeks, depending on the weather, we hook up this little adjustable fan sprinkler and keep an eye on how much water has gone out. And so we'll talk about that just a little bit more, but all the information you would need to know about thinking about taking on these topics is, again, that retrofitting turf irrigation systems. So we are going to assume from now on that you have thought about and have your plan for your irrigation system. And we're going to really start to then focus on the garden installation. Saw a couple of questions come in, so this is a good time for us to shift. So from Leslie, what time of day do you water? Spray irrigation gets lost in the heat of the day. Absolutely. So watering is, if possible, best done early morning, right before or as the sun is rising. You can also do it in the evening, but if we have warm evenings, and in inland Southern California, it seems like some of our evenings the last few years stay warmer than they used to get, cool off even more significantly, I feel like, than it does now these days sometimes. But if you have warm evenings and wet foliage, it can, on some plants, promote some fungal disease issues. So early morning is always good because then the foliage dries off pretty quickly. So so on my automatic irrigation systems, like my front yard native garden, I have a weird wedge-shaped front yard where the manual sprinkler options, they would have a bunch of overspray. So there, that system goes off at like 4 o'clock in the morning, usually most times of the year, about every 3 to 4 weeks, depending on the weather. And then it dries off pretty quickly. And then with the manual irrigation, like when I run the fan sprinkler in my backyard, I do that early morning. And so basically, normally it's, if I know a section needs to run, I wake up for work at 5:30. And so kind of after I get my act together, normally by 6:30, I'll get that started. And on the ones that I'm connecting to a hose, I have generally, if I'm going to be leaving for work, have figured out how long it needs to run. And I have one of those little kind of manual dial. It'll run up to 2 hours. It's kind of like a kitchen timer thing connected to it. So I just set it for how long I figured out that it needs to run, how I have it set up in the different areas. And then it's going to be done before the heat and the evaporation really becomes an issue. So that's kind of how I work that. And then another thing is, if you are doing spray irrigation and you're in an area where it gets windy in the afternoon, we have a lot of areas like that. My house during parts of the year gets that. Then that's another reason why you want to do that in the morning. So good question, Leslie. And then for drip irrigation, or if you are going to be leaving a slow drip, with a hose and kind of moving it every few minutes, then you're not really prone to evaporation. So, that's less of an issue. That can kind of go any time of the day. So shifting to talk about garden installation. First thing you want to think about, kind of always just focus on this. You always want to revisit your goals. You want to start with your goals, let that drive your design. But as you move towards installation, sometimes you'll realize something that you forgot about before. And before you put your plants in the ground, before you build your dry stream bed, if you need to make any adjustments, it's really easy. Once you have your design drawn out or figured out, that's just kind of a conceptual document to help you get to a good end result. Feel free to change that as you notice new things. So revisit your goals. And so for most of the installation section of this, I'm going to use the backyard at the place I currently live as a case study. It's a backyard in Pomona, so inland Southern California, a typical 1950s constructed suburb. We happen to have a pretty large backyard. Our house happens to be on a cul-de-sac. And for some strange reason, when that cul-de-sac was built, so the front yard is a narrow wedge, and all the backyards get wider as they go. And it was at the edge of that development. And for some reason, there was just like extra space. And this lot got the extra space. So the whole property itself is about 1/3 of an acre. So for some of you, that's not huge. But for my neighborhood, it's pretty big. The lot wasn't in great shape. But my partner and I are both professional horticulture people. So that's really why we purchased the house and moved into the house about 3 years ago now. So you will be seeing kind of 2.5 years, I think, of work in this. And so we'll start with sharing what the goals for our backyard were. So the goals for the backyard were habitat for multiple things, really focusing though on people, birds, insects, and lizards. We wanted a diverse collection of California native plants because we are big plant nerds. So for the average homeowner, you wouldn't want this many different plants in the backyard. So what we kind of tried to do is balance having something that looks nice, but still having a big collection of plants, because every time we plant a plant, we learn a lot more from it. We like to see what they do and how they grow, so then we can more confidently use them in our project. So our front yard doesn't have as much diversity. When I design for other people, I generally don't have as much diversity, but in the backyard, we were focused on diversity. That was one of our goals. We also had some drainage issues on the property that we wanted to fix and also capture and infiltrate water when it does rain. We wanted to add visual interest to the yard. In some areas, we wanted to eventually, over time, as plants grow in, add privacy. And then one way we wanted to build in this botanical diversity, because we had enough space, is to have different areas for different kinds of plant communities. And so we weren't being very specific, like replicating exactly one specific spot in California, but we had an area that's a combination of local kind of chaparral stuff that would grow on kind of the lower slopes of our local mountains, as well as desert plants kind of mixed in different areas. And that's a pretty compatible in our area mix that you can have that can take similar care. And then also some meadow and grassland areas, as well as areas for fruit trees and vegetable gardens. And then for our backyard, we actually decided to build it more like a sculpture than a specific planned garden. And what I mean by that is that we kind of figured it out as we went along. We get some ideas, we talk about it, we decide on the ideas, but it wasn't like we created a plan for the whole backyard at once. And in fact, we kind of built it in phases and knew that we were going to discover how we wanted to live in the yard as we went. So we weren't trying to get it all perfect right away. Our front yard, we did a design, we did the turf replacement rebate, we did it, kind of very typical process. The backyard, we kind of figured it out as we went along. Either way is absolutely fine as a homeowner. It's whatever is going to be, better for you, more fun for you, more interesting for you. Another thing is, because we're building kind of a collection in that backyard of plants, we wouldn't be able to just hit the nursery and get all the plants we wanted at once. So kind of building it out slowly over time allowed us the flexibility to acquire interesting plants as we went. And so this is the backyard of the house when we first went to look at it in April 2018. And unfortunately, we did have to take down most of the trees. They were seedling ash and Chinese elm trees, which are not only invasive, but most of them had never been cared for. And they were just growing because the backyard space had been neglected. So they were actually hazardous. We looked at them with an arborist and we ended up taking out most of them and then planting many more trees. We did have one native coast live oak tree, which we're very happy that we were able to save and is doing very well. But a lot of these have been growing along the wall at the edge of the property and also would have caused significant damage. So taking out the invasive trees that were hazardous and putting in better trees that would better support habitat were part of our goals as well. There was a big broken concrete slab, which was much larger than we would need in one space, and also was lifted enough to kind of be hazardous. And so that's what we were kind of starting to work with. And so in thinking through our goals and our design, we made some decisions. We decided that we were going to reduce the size of this patio area, especially this outer area. We wanted more garden out here, and this was not going to be safe, but we were going to keep, as long as that concrete was there. I wouldn't have, if I was designing from scratch, put in a big concrete slab. I would have done something that was permeable to the rain, like a gravel or decomposed granite patio. And we'll look at those materials later on if you're wondering what those are. But since we already had that, we were going to keep part of it. And then we were going to reuse all of the material when we break this up to do another small patio space over here, as well as use the broken concrete for stepping stones and other things like that in our garden. So we weren't going to be throwing much of it out, just kind of little tiny crumbly pieces that we couldn't reuse. And we were going to have a series of those planted areas, trees to provide shade, spaces to sit and enjoy the garden and all of that. And so rather than focus on design, because this is not a design class, you'll kind of see that start to be built as we focus on how we built each section of that. So now we are going to then move into thinking about site preparation. So ask yourself, if you have existing turf, is your turf dead and are your weeds under control? So in this backyard area, we did not have turf. It was just a weedy kind of dry area. And so we didn't really need to worry about the turf. If you do have turf, definitely check out our Removing Your Lawn the Right Way workshop. Then irrigation work as necessary. And for the native and Waterwise sections of this backyard, we didn't put in any permanent irrigation system, working with hose attachments, basically. And again, there's a whole other class on that. So we're not going to focus on that. We're going to really start focusing on the site layout. And normally site layout, I think of as two kind of separate parts. When you're thinking about taking either your design or your concept to reality, the first thing you're going to want to do is lay out basically everything except most of the plants. And so your site layout of round one is going to be somehow marking out where your pathways, any patios, any grading, meaning any soil you need to move, whether you're digging down or building mounds, is going to go. Your water capture features like a dry stream bed or something like that that's going to harvest water from your roof and hold on to it in a specific place in your garden. And then also I will be considering and really making sure that they're going into the right place, any large tree locations, anything that's going to kind of be big and permanent. If you want to lay out more than that, you can. But the reason why you don't lay out all of your individual plants at that point in time is because then you're going to be moving soil. If your soil is compact, maybe you're going to have to be loosening the soil. And if you have all of your individual smaller plants laid out, all those little flags, or if you are actually laying it out with like those plant pots, that's all going to have to move around to accommodate all of that. From there, generally, you're going to want to do your hardscape construction, like any pathways or patios or anything like that, shade structures, before the plants, at least around those areas, go in, because it's very easy to damage, trample, compact soil around small plants when you're doing that work. It's better to do that work, clean up, then prep the site for planting, and then plant right afterwards. Then any additional irrigation work, like those last drip emitters or any of that sort of stuff, or if you have to run pipes around or anything like that. Then normally after all of that stuff is done, when I plant my plants, I want the site to be ready. I want the soil to be clean, to not have any junk from other construction in it. If for some reason concrete or mortar has been poured, that stuff is really alkaline and not great to have in the soil. If you need to dig some of that out around the edge of where your patio went in, for example, you can do that. If anything got compacted, you can loosen the soil, get things, rake things out, make sure if you're building mounds or dry stream, that's all done. And then you can lay out your final planting and then move into getting your plants in the ground. So really having things prepped before that final planting is ideal. And then, that's not to say that if you're doing a whole big backyard that you have to wait to plant a single thing until all of that is done. But at least in each area, you want to wait till you can really have everything prepped for planting before you go ahead and plant. If you're doing a big backyard as a DIY project, you're probably going to be breaking it up into phases. That's definitely what I've done with this, and some of the projects I'm still working on 3 years later, because that's just the reality. So here you can see December 2018 is when I really got started. Rented a breaker from Home Depot, kind of like a mini jackhammer like thing, and started busting up this extra concrete, then working the best I could here to get kind of an organic shape at the edge that was going to connect to a stepping stone path that goes around the side. And you'll see more pictures of that later. And it's just sort of a process for me of kind of learning how this concrete wants to break using that tool. These chunks of concrete are quite heavy. So something like this is definitely an advanced DIY project or something to take on with a bunch of other people. I'm pretty able-bodied, but for some of the larger slabs we were trying to reuse, I definitely needed to also get help from my partner, as well as a pretty heavy-duty dolly to kind of get things out of the way. So I'm going to just kind of quickly show you the process. This would be something that some of you for this hardscape stuff would maybe want to take on. Some of you would not. And so breaking things up the best we can and then reusing these parts. Here was an area that we had to break out or do something about, because we would get a lot of water accumulating in our driveway coming down this way, and this whole area would flood. Eventually it would flood over, but we get our concrete slab was 2 or 3 inches above the soil level with no mulch. And so this whole area would get stuck with 2 or 3 inches of water up against the foundation of our house. And so what we decided to do is just break all of this out through this section, and then take a few of our largest pieces of concrete and have them be stepping stones with gravel in between, so the water could just flow through the gravel. And so we did a lot of our kind of site demolition work. Here, this is the area where we were going to build that second little patio space. This is right outside of a sliding glass door that goes to our bedroom. And so doing some prep work, and then taking a moment to sit and think about it, especially because we're deciding to build this as a sculpture. We knew we wanted this patio space here. I kind of got that kind of roughly leveled with the dirt, and then sit and kind of look around. When you are doing your actual garden layout, whether it's just kind of sketching out thoughts or actually transferring a plan to kind of get that going into reality from your paper plan, there's a number of things that I consider sort of essentials for garden layout. And depending on the scale of your garden, you don't necessarily need to spend a bunch of money. You can use what you have. So I find pretty indispensable for most kind of initial layout where I'm thinking about where plants want to go. before I put out individual plants, especially if I'm kind of sketching things out and I'm not really working from a formal planting plan, which was the case for this backyard, these little sprinkler flags that you can get at any landscape supply store in bundles of 100 can be pretty useful. If you just have one small project, you can use some rocks or sticks or, anything else. However, if you're going to be reusing them, these sprinkler flags can be very useful for larger areas, or if you want to mark something like the edge of a path or where a tree is going to be, where you're going to look at it over a number of weeks and you're going to measure out where it goes and you don't want to lose that spot, at least at the, maybe two ends of a path. These wood stakes that you can get at any hardware store are very useful. If you're going to be pounding in wood stakes, depending on your soil, it can be pretty hard to do with a normal hammer. The main thing that someone would use is a 4-pound sledgehammer. And then the two essential things are a measuring tape and something to kind of mark the ground if you're going to be laying out pathways or dry stream bed edges or things like that. And oftentimes people have an old bag of flour in their pantry, garage pantry space, something like that. That's perfect. You can get like gypsum, like for marking out sports fields or things like that. Flour works just as well, and most people have some old flour on hand. And if you are going to be doing long measurements, this may or may not be worth it for you. Is for some people, is not for others. Normal measuring tape, 25 or 30 foot, is plenty useful. But if you're going to be doing long measurements across a yard, can be very useful to invest in a longer measuring tape, whether it's a 100 foot or if you have a really large yard, a 200-foot measuring tape. And I will show you also why sometimes if you have a kind of more intricate layout for your garden installation, they are useful because they're a little bit more flexible and easy to work with in a landscape situation than a typical metal sort of tape measure. And so what I like about these is you can use a screwdriver as a little stake, and through the end, you can stick that screwdriver in. There's a little hole at the beginning of the tape measure, and then you can pull it. So if you're one person laying out a garden space, that's super useful. So here's an example of a mixed vegetable bed, and then in the background was going to be a kind of native meadow garden space at our demonstration garden at the Waterwise Community Center that I was laying out. And so I started by just laying out this tape measure across the whole main area, and that gave me marks to work from my plan. If you are going to be doing anything kind of semi-formal, where you're going to be trying to work with right angles, the other tool that I really like to use, so for example, if I want a pathway coming just completely straight off of this sidewalk, I use a framing square. So this is also something that you can get at any hardware store. And so you can see here how I set up my kind of perfect right angle to come just perpendicular off of the main path. I have my main tape measure, I laid this out, and then I use that as a visual guide. Sometimes I'll stretch another tape measure, and then once I get the first couple of feet of that tape measure perfectly aligned with this framing square, it kind of eyeballs to kind of keep that perfect angle going. And then in corners and things like that, for exactly where this kind of formal square of raised beds wants to go, really want to make sure that's aligned. So I used a bunch of these flags. It's useful to have a couple of colors. I don't remember exactly what colors I was using for what, but kind of I said, for that day, I am going to use purple to mean this, orange to mean this. I think one was bed corners, one was pathways. Getting that going, and then using that bag of flour to just kind of sprinkle things out. So for example, here would be the formal layout of those 4 vegetable beds, the pathway that's going to go around it, and then there was going to be a curving pathway that we lay out from there. Here's another example. This is when I was laying out the backyard space when I was helping my parents with their turf removal rebate process. And here it was an informal, happens to be another informal meadowy but low water garden. And we were going to have a recirculating water feature in the middle with some plants around it. And then a pathway that was just going to be defined by, it's just going to be wood chip pathway, but just to be defined by the fact that there were no plants there. But to lay that out, make sure it looks good before we actually start planting everything and can walk through. Just took a single stake, hit it where we thought the middle was going to want to be into the ground. And then I just had some webbed kind of strapping left over from another project. Really, you can use anything that's not very stretchy. tied a loose loop around the stake, and then pulled it with a measuring tape, figured out my measurement, and then just holding that tight, use that almost like a big compass to sprinkle a circle, and then pulled it another, I think it was 4 feet there, because we knew these plants were going to grow over some and still wanted a nice walkable space, and then sprinkled it again. So basically building a giant compass to lay out the circles, and then just kind of from there, the other pathway parts. This was going to be an area for a bench. I just happened to see a question come in from George. What is this stick-looking semi-grass-like plant? This is a South African native plant, so it grows well in our area, called small cape rush, or Chondropetalum tectorum. It's very kind of sculptural. Looks like it would be a high water plant, but it's actually a low water plant. So moving on. So when you are going from layout to actually starting to do work, let's talk tools. This is going to seem obvious to some of you, but I have worked with a lot of community members and homeowners who, because they just haven't grown up gardening, don't know what tool to use for what. So for those of you who know this already, bear with me, but for some of you, this will probably be useful information. And using the right tool for the job is absolutely critical to making a project go well. If you use the wrong shovel, it's going to be so much more physical work, or things that should be possible might seem impossible. If you are digging into the ground, digging up turf, digging soil, digging a dry stream bed, digging holes to put plants in, you want a spade, also called a digging shovel or a round point shovel, available from any hardware store. Has the point at the end. Do not try to dig holes in the ground with a square point or flat shovel. That's not what it's meant for. It will take so much more work for most soil types, or seem just about impossible. I highly recommend you go and get one of these if you're going to be planting a garden. This is meant for moving materials, moving gravel around, scraping up gravel, or if you have a pile of soil that you're loading into a wheelbarrow but not digging down into the soil, this scoop will fit more material on it per scoop than this one. Great for that. Not good for digging into the ground, though. If you are going to be smoothing out soil or raking out wood chip mulch or gravel mulch to do a final kind of like even layer, a bow rake or a hard-toothed rake is the kind of essential tool for that. If you are going to be moving a lot of wood chip mulch around, a bedding fork is one of my favorite tools. Shovels don't work that well. If you just have, a couple of small beds, you can maybe move it by hand. But if you're doing a yard, some sort of good fork, and it kind of depends on the texture of your mulch. Kind of more typical wider 4-tine pitchfork that you will more commonly see at a hardware store is going to work for a number of different types and textures of mulch. But for some kinds of wood chip mulch, those tines for the ones with just 4 tines are too far apart. So this 10-tine one, which you basically need to order online, try to find a reasonable priced one. Sometimes you'll see them like $100. You don't need that. Poke around. Should be a $35 to $40 tool. Can be very useful. This is my favorite tool for spreading mulch. And so from there, we're going to talk about patio basics. So this is the area that you saw me sitting at, kind of contemplating the next step, thinking about the exact plantings I would want to go in around it. But we knew that we wanted this patio space here as a smaller, kind of more intimate social space, not directly connected to our larger space. So here we would have on our main concrete space, that's where we would put an outdoor like table to eat at. Here was something for, a couple of chairs and a coffee table to be surrounded by plants, enough to kind of separate the space and kind of eventually have more of a direct connection with the bedroom area. And so there's a couple of tools that you might find useful for your landscape work if you are going to be doing anything that needs to be level. This could be a pathway, a patio space, or anything like that. And so one of them is a line level. I'm not going to spend too much time on this because it's not going to be relevant to all of you, but just to introduce you to these tools. A line level is a little level. This thing's only like maybe 3 inches long, works like a typical bubble level, except it's meant to hang on a surveyor's line. So this is you buy this in like a 100 or 200 foot little spool. Oftentimes it comes on a little holder that lets you dispense the line and reel it back in. And it's meant to work with that. You wouldn't want to try to put this on twine. It won't connect, right? It kind of clips onto there. And so what you can do is if you're trying, for example, to level or have pretty close to level a space like this across the top, you can hit in a couple of stakes. You tie it to one of the stakes. And then normally it's a 2-person job. One person holds the line tight and kind of raises and lowers it on the other side, while the other person keeps an eye on that bubble. And while that bubble is perfectly in the middle, they say stop. And then you can loop that a number of times around the other stake, maybe tie it, so it doesn't shift. And normally you would do that. So in this case, we work from this direction and the other direction, loop it around a bunch of times. And then you don't need to cut it each time. It's still connected to that roll. And so when you're done, you unloop it and just roll it back up. So for here, we wanted to start this and we want it to be pretty level across the whole top. And so what we did is we did that. And then from this line, you can measure down with a normal measuring tape. And so, if we were leveling everything and wanting it to be consistent with the existing level here, if that's 10 inches, then we can add soil or remove a little bit of soil along this whole area until everything was about 10 inches. From there, this is good for kind of like perimeter measurements and things. From there, as we were working, we'd use these other levels. And so with the other levels, to do a general leveling, you can put one of these levels. A 2-foot one is kind of the standard one. If you're doing a lot of work, or if you do construction work, you might have a 4-foot one. That's overkill for most people doing casual landscape projects. But you can put this 2-foot level, which works the same way, over a large, like a long 2x4, like a 10-foot long 2x4, and use that to kind of level things out. Or as you put down kind of individual stepping stones or pieces of broken concrete, then you can kind of level each one. If you're doing say, for example, a gravel or especially a decomposed granite patio, another essential tool is going to be a tamper. And so this is just a heavy metal plate. So for most decomposed granite patios, you are going to be ordering. So this is a light colored decomposed granite. Oftentimes there's a tan color decomposed granite. And for that, you are normally going to be ordering your material from the soil yard already mixed in with something called a binder, which gets it to hold together. We're not going to go through the whole process, but just to make you aware of it, and I'm sure you can look up videos online that go through the whole process if you're going to do that. But it's going to be a process of putting it down, making sure it's not super wet, but a little bit evenly moist. And with that, that activates that binder, which is normally a natural product. And then you tamp it down. So it can be a lot of work. And that's how you get it kind of compact, so it's not loose and sandy. If you're working with either flagstones or broken concrete, something very useful to kind of get things level but not chip your material and get things nice and snug is what's called a dead blow hammer. And that's a hammer that has kind of like little ball bearings inside. And so it makes it so you're less likely to break and chip your individual stepping stones as you kind of try to smack them into place and get them level. And so that's kind of the process that I went through for this broken concrete patio. Again, this is a lot of work, kind of an advanced DIY project, but all my materials for this were free. Some people who do something like this, it's common to use decomposed granite to kind of fill the spaces in between. We had a pretty sandy soil. I just used the soil that I had for 2 reasons. One, we had just bought a fixer-upper house and did not have a whole lot of budget for landscape materials. We were prioritizing just being able to buy the plants and put the irrigation system in the front. And the other thing is we knew that we wanted to allow like some wildflowers and other stuff to grow in between. And the soil was going to be good for that as well. And so this, took quite a while, but we were pretty happy with the results and kind of working with packing soil underneath, leveling each piece, and then kind of just using the back of a little hand trowel to kind of pack in between each space. And so this kind of started to set up the structure of our yard that we're going to infill in between. Moving into January. An example from another site, which is a school garden that we put in. And in the school garden, there was going to be a center seating area. This is off of a main walkway with some benches, and then to be surrounded by native Palo Verde trees. And so the first thing we did for this decomposed granite walkway is we did some rough leveling. We allowed just a little bit of a slope to go this way, but pretty level across. And then we put in this metal edging. Most approaches to decomposed granite patios, you're going to have some sort of edging, kind of like landscape edging. And I'm a fan of metal edging. The plastic edging is really easy to work with. And so in some cases is going to be the most expedient thing to use. But the brown plastic recycled edging generally doesn't look great after a couple of years. And then sometimes the bigger issue is that the stakes that they connect to, it's not the most robust system. I'm a fan of metal edging because it lasts a long time, it stays looking good, and the stakes are just a little bit more solid. It's going to be more expensive. And then the other drawback is that it does take like a Sawzall or a power tool or just a lot of patience with a hacksaw to cut. So it will be for some people, won't be for other people. But in terms of the best project outcome, I really do like the metal edging. So laying that out, kind of raking, getting rid of any little rocks to the extent possible. And with a decomposed granite kind of area, you're going to want minimum 2, ideally 3 inches of depth for your decomposed granite. You don't just want like a tiny little kind of surface cast. And so this is kind of what we had. You can see some of our other site prep work was ongoing as well. And then underneath, definitely a decomposed granite patio space or walkway. Sometimes with gravel, that's kind of up to you. Really with gravel, it's just if you know you're going to need weed control, you will use the landscape cloth weed barrier. I never, ever, ever recommend this for weed control in an outer garden area. In a garden area, it breaks down over time. It becomes a little less permeable over time. But if it's underneath an aggregate product like decomposed granite or gravel, it keeps things separated from kind of getting mushed into the normal soil over time. And especially with decomposed granite, that's generally pretty standard and essential. And then the decomposed granite goes out. So for just a 2 to 3 inch layer, in most cases, it can all be raked out, wet down so that, again, it's evenly kind of moist, but not wet, and then compacted. And so in most residential situations, you would use that hand tamper. A vibrating compactor makes the work a lot quicker. You can rent them, but this thing weighs like a couple 100 pounds. It needs the weight to do that. So like, for example, when we did this, the agriculture teacher at the school had a tractor that was used to brought it over, but it's not even something that even 2 strong people would want to generally lift out the back of a truck. So in most cases, it's just a process of hand tamping over maybe a few days because it's a lot of physical work. If you did a gravel patio, you don't need to compact it because it's just kind of a loose aggregate. And so that's kind of the decomposed granite, kind of the just kind of basic 101 of working with decomposed granite for pathway areas. If you're using decomposed granite as like the mulch in the planting areas, it's different. For that, you would use decomposed granite without binder, and you would just put that down loosely. You don't want to cause the compaction. If you do use decomposed granite in either of these areas, you want it to be in relatively flat areas. A gentle little slope like the pathway you see here is okay. But if it's on a steep sloped area, even with the binder, when there's a decent rain event, it does tend to erode. And so here you can see it's a really nice example of a small native and Waterwise landscape, freshly put in. And here they actually did use the plastic edging, which is easier to work with, especially on a tight radius, and it did look pretty good. And I liked, this was a nice application of this where there's the parkway planting, but then to focus people's steps and allow the car door to open. They didn't give the whole parkway over to this little walking path, but just a narrow walking path, kind of focus where people enter. Or a gravel patio space, which can be the easiest to put in, can be really kind of nice with the crunch and feel of gravel. This is kind of, in some cases, if you're just starting from scratch, would probably be my go-to just for the feel, the kind of environmental friendliness of the materials. In most cases, you can get a gravel which kind of comes from your region. It's going to look the most natural and will be the least expensive. Doesn't take a lot of skill to put in. Do need a good wheelbarrow because it will be a lot of wheelbarrow loads, but you just really want to make sure that you do good weed control ahead of time, because it is a pain to do weeding of things that come up in gravel pathways or patios. I've definitely had the situation where I work in gardens where there's a lot of weeding to be done, and that is kind of a pain. You can use that weed barrier underneath gravel. The only thing is you might need to rake it back into place, because as the gravel kicks and moves around, sometimes you see that weed barrier, and it's not that beautiful to look at. So here's just some other slides of kind of these hardscape elements that are common in native and Waterwise gardens before then we start talking about the actual kind of gardeny stuff, the planting kind of part of it. I guess this is all gardeny stuff, but before we talk plants, because that's normally the process, you would put this pathway and edging in well before your plants go in. And so here is a decomposed granite pathway lined with natural river rock stone. I really love this work. And you will see a number of the pictures that I use of gardens are credited to the Theodore Payne Foundation Native Plant Garden Tour. Theodore Payne Foundation is a nonprofit based in Sun Valley, in the San Fernando Valley of Southern California, dedicated to native plant conservation and promoting the use of native plants. They have their own awesome nursery, beautiful demonstration plantings there, definitely worth checking out. They do workshops as well. And it's a great place to go shop for native plants because their staff really knows their stuff and can make great recommendations. They also put on an awesome garden tour every spring. And one of the coolest things about that is that they also keep an archive of the pictures of the past houses that have been on the garden tour. So if you want to check out Theodore Payne Foundation itself, it's theodorepayne.org. And if you want to check out their native plant garden tour, I believe it's nativeplantgardentour.org. Definitely worth checking out for lots of inspiration, and not only for the plantings, but being able to see just all these different kind of approaches to landscape design and construction. So here is another picture from their tour. Gravel, kind of a wide pathway / patio space using a very small pea gravel with natural river rock edging. We're also working with just stepping stones. So sometimes working with just plain concrete stepping stones from the hardware store is cost effective and can have a very nice effect. I just saw in the chat that Kit has texted in a recommendation for some edging that works very well and is easy to install. So if you are thinking about edging, you might check that out. I will definitely be checking that out after the class. I'm always interested to learn about new materials that work well for people. So thank you very much, Kit, for bringing that in the chat. And then did see a question coming in. Lily asked, any tips on how to minimize water runoff from decomposed granite paths into the street? The only thing that I could recommend for that is just if there's a way to if all of that water runoff is from water that has fallen directly on the decomposed granite path, then unfortunately I don't. That's just all about the design of the original path and the angles. And in fact, there's a whole decomposed granite access road on our facility's property, which we have runoff issues every time it rains. In my opinion, when the original design, it probably should have never been decomposed granite because there's just slightly enough slope, but there's always runoff. It probably should have been a structural gravel access road instead. So sometimes you're just kind of stuck with it. The only thing would be if there is water that you can prevent from running across or onto the pathway in the first place, So for example, like if there's water running onto it from adjacent garden areas, maybe digging a shallow trench next to the decomposed granite pathway and filling that, whether you need to go 6 inches down or a foot, filling that with gravel so it can absorb some of that water into the ground right before it hits the pathway. Thinking about things like that. But sometimes, unfortunately, you're just kind of stuck with it after it's been built. Okay, so moving on, another picture kind of combining flagstone filled with decomposed granite, gravel and stone mulch on the side. And then I like how this goes from a flagstone pathway or kind of edge of a patio into more of just a decomposed granite, but the fill kind of becomes the main pathway material. Couple of tips if you're laying out pathways. So you already saw kind of my tips in terms of the layout for getting those right angles, those straight lines, if you are going to be having a more formal approach. If you are having kind of more an informal, kind of naturalistic curving landscape, it can actually be very hard, especially if you've not done it a bunch. But even if you have done it a bunch, it can be very hard to actually do the final layout of like a graceful, natural feeling kind of curve. And so this is going to be way bigger than most people's home gardens. This is another kind of school garden project in a field area that we were working on. But it shows one of my two favorite approaches to kind of really figuring out that nice curve of the pathway before then marking things out. And so the easiest one for most homeowners is going to be take a typical rubber garden hose, leave it out in the sun for an hour or so. You don't want to do it first thing on a cold morning because then, as you know, the garden hose is going to be kind of stiff and awkward. Leave it out in the sun for a little while so it's nice and flexible. And then kind of do your best to lay out what you think the nice kind of curve or direction of your path will be. And you're not going to get it totally right the first time. You're going to be pushing and pulling and adjusting, and it's going to be a big pain. But then eventually you will get it. And then that becomes your kind of main pathway. And then you have a couple of options of how you want to use that. Sometimes I will do that as the center line of my path. And then you can measure off to each side and kind of mark each edge. So that's what we did here. Here, if you have a larger landscape or are also doing an irrigation project at the same time, what you can do is you can take long lengths of PVC pipe, and normally the PVC pipe has a little end where you can slip one into the other. And that forms something that, because it's not quite as flexible as a garden hose, you can get these longer, graceful kind of curves a little bit more easily. Whether it's a PVC pipe or a garden hose, one of the things sometimes that I'll do ahead of time is I'll know, for example, on this, we didn't know the exact curve yet, but we knew that this was like one specific point where we wanted the curve to go, kind of the peak of the curve. Back over here, there was another point. And so I hit some of those wood stakes into the ground, and then you can kind of lay it out and make sure you hit the farthest spots you want, and then kind of smooth things out in between. And oftentimes, if it's a long path, what I'll do is instead of doing it with a measuring tape, I'll take a stick, or if I've been doing irrigation work and I have some small extra pieces of PVC pipe. And so, for example, if it's like a 3 foot or 4 foot wide path, I'll cut a marker to 3 feet or 4 feet. And then you can kind of mark the center, and then you can kind of line that up. And whether you're doing flags or rocks or flower, kind of lay out your path from there. So that's kind of paths. The next structural thing that we would talk about is, what do you do about rainwater? So again, this part is going to be a little bit of an introduction, because coming up later in the season, as well as available online right now, we have our entire Rainwater Harvesting for Home Landscapes workshop. But the idea is, if you're doing a landscape renovation, this is your chance to make some changes. And oftentimes you can take rainwater, which might be a problem at our property. We would have flooding issues in the front yard because of how water came onto the property and just where the house was. That kind of formed like a little dam. And we wanted to turn that into a resource. And then oftentimes, if you do it a little bit with an eye towards aesthetics, you can have a beautiful functional kind of feature in your garden, which actually holds on to and hydrates your landscape. And in good rain years, actually helps recharge your local groundwater basin, which is awesome. So here's just kind of briefly, as we kind of continue along with the kind of construction process, how we approach rainwater on this property. So we would get flooding up against the house here. Basically, when it was just turf, the lawn would overland flow. Now this landscape is a native mulched landscape, and so that probably absorbs all the water. But coming down from this long driveway, water would come here, and then it would flatten out, get clogged here, get clogged up here, and we'd be underneath like an inch of water sometimes walking to the car in the morning. So we wanted to turn that into a resource. So this is during construction, but basically what we ended up doing is we dug along here a trench that was filled with gravel, also called a French drain, that would take the initial water off of the roof, as well as any water that did come down this way. And in a small rain event, it just hold on to it there. In a large rain event, it would bring that water around. We continued the French drain along here, along the edge of the driveway to take that in. And then eventually into the backyard, where it would cross that area where we broke up those stepping stones that kind of formed that low dam where this whole area would flood, and then let that go out into a wider dry stream bed system, kind of a series of pools that could infiltrate and overflow into one another, and then eventually down into this area that we built as a sunken meadow with plants that don't need a lot of water, but can take, total flooding. And so you'll see that. So this is kind of intricate, but we're super into this stuff. But you might use any one or any kind of subset of that sort of stuff. And we go way into the design and construction of that in the Rainwater Harvesting for Home Landscapes workshop. But here's the basics. Here's our trench that we filled with gravel, our French drain. Our roof doesn't have roof gutters, and our eaves are curved, which would make it kind of a pain to install roof gutters and have them be secured. We'd have to do kind of a lot of surgery or adding a lot of wood, making changes. And so we just decided to not do that and solve it this way. So it dug down, and we can only dig down a little less than a foot here because there was the irrigation piping. So just dug down carefully where we could. And that would capture the water, eventually filling it with this gravel. This is about 1.5 inch to 2 inch gravel that we got from the local landscape materials yard. And that's the perfect size. And this is just a local kind of washed river rock. So it looks kind of nice as well. And just filling that up. And then the open spaces in between the gravel, just the natural air spaces, would be what has the water holding capacity. And this walkway kind of gently slopes down. And so this kind of just gently took that slope. And so in a decent rain event, the water would come along this way. We dug underneath the existing concrete walk. That is kind of a pain to do, but it's definitely doable. In most cases, as long as your concrete's in decent shape and not cracked or whatever, you can dig down a hole on both sides. And then with a shovel, eventually with a trowel, and then finally break through. Sometimes just going and getting a decently long piece of galvanized metal pipe from the hardware store and smacking it with that 4-pound sledgehammer, you can kind of break through. And so we did that, put a pipe in just to make sure that the water that's going through here didn't erode the soil underneath, since we couldn't really reinforce it like the rest would be reinforced with gravel. And then in a large storm event, it would go all the way around. This also was harvesting water from this asphalt driveway, which would get water pooled in it. And then going around to where the dry stream bed was going to open up. And so how I lay out dry stream beds just in kind of a backyard basis is I have an idea of the size of it, and you can get way into, and we talk a little bit about it in the rainwater harvesting class. You can get way into the calculations of, if it rains 1 inch, I'm going to get this much water off my roof, making sure you have capacity to hold on to it. But in most people's backyards, what happens is you kind of need to work with the space you have, because you're not going to turn your whole yard into a big gravel pit to capture rainwater. And so either whether or not I've kind of done calculations and figured out how large of an area I need to do, or I'm just kind of working with the landscape more intuitively, when I come to start laying things out, the first thing I'll do, even before I get out stakes or chalk or whatever, is I'll just use the corner of a shovel and I'll start drawing some lines on the ground So this is the backyard. Here you can see here's the edge of the patio. And so we had our concept pretty well figured out. We knew that eventually we were going to move from that dry stream or the French drain to more of a dry stream bed that would need to be wider than this, but this was kind of going to be the bottom. And then it would open up to that final infiltration basin out here. And we had already observed that this happened to be a natural low spot in the yard. So if there was a big rain event, the water that didn't get stuck up closer to the house, the water that came off the roof of the backyard or just flowed from the backyard, would kind of pool up here. So we're just going to make that deeper and kind of embrace that natural drainage and then bring more water to it if we needed to. It's kind of working that out. We knew that because of where we were putting our raised vegetable beds, this was going to kind of be the trickiest, most constricted space. We needed enough room for a pathway here. We wanted to have some nice plantings along the patio space here. And then we needed our dry stream bed to be here. So that kind of took the most refining. And so you can see what I did is I took my bag of flour and I marked out the edge of where I absolutely knew that the boundaries of my pathway wanted to be. I wanted at least 3 feet before we hit any of the rock of the dry stream bed, flat space along my veggie beds. And so that's kind of the preset boundaries. And then I started kind of drawing out with the shovel and then digging. And so quick digging tips for those of you who don't do a lot of digging. Again, so we're using our pointed shovel or our spade. And generally what you want to do for digging is kind of start along an edge and kind of work that edge. So taking out a chunk at a time. And then you can go to the other edge, work out that edge, take out a chunk of a time. And then there's going to be some loose stuff in the bottom, clear that out, and then you can keep going. And then if you're going to be making this thing wider, the easiest thing to do then is to move back a little bit and then take out another chunk, but lifting that soil forward into an area that's already open on the other side, that's already been dug out, because that really allows less resistance up against your shovel rather than kind of digging new holes kind of randomly here or there and slowly bringing that out. So kind of slowly doing that work. Keeping your back straight. So I've been doing this for too long. And also from probably lifting weights without good form when I was in college, I do have some back issues. So wear a back brace and I'm able to do this work even though I don't have a great back by having very good form. So keeping my back straight, wear boots. Do not wear flip-flops when you're digging. If you only have athletic shoes, you can use a pair of athletic shoes that are, not great because they will get very dirty. But if you have boots, use them because you're literally kicking the shovel. That's how the action works. And so if you have a pair of boots, it's going to make life a lot easier. And then working with your legs more than your back. If you're lifting with your back, you're going to get tired very quickly. Your back's not meant to do that work. Your legs are literally, as humans have evolved to do all that sort of work ongoing, hours or days at a time. And so here you can see the water flow as it's starting to come together. I wanted to show this picture because we haven't cleaned things up yet. We haven't even dug the width out. We haven't gotten any gravel or rock in. But already, once we open the flow to the water, things have changed. And so here is what I mentioned. You saw the demolition. We took our 3 largest pieces of broken concrete. This was definitely a 2-person job to get these into place. And now the water can flow in between. It's not a dam. Water can flow around from the front. And this is just kind of the bottom, again, area. Eventually, this will be wider, but you can see the flow of the water into these couple of areas where we kept kind of a mini little dam in between that could overflow. So some water could soak in and hydrate the garden here. If it overflows, it can go here. And then finally, there's the final kind of pooling spot. And then we saved a couple of other big pieces of broken concrete to kind of reinforce and become a little bridge across. As we dug this, we took that soil and immediately mounded it on the uphill side to kind of create a terrace. That was going to be a planting area more on the level of the little patio space. And you will see so here you can see it better and you'll continue to see it kind of evolve. And so kind of sculpting that landscape. And again, this is not something, if you do it as a DIY project, that you're going to knock out in one weekend, even if you have a pretty small yard. But it's kind of a bit at a time, but you can really take your time and enjoy the process. And so here you can see kind of after the rain event. And so here it is with the garden planted and the basic gravel in. And so what we did is, as we were digging all of that, depending on where you live, you might start digging some rock out of the soil. Here at our yard, we have pretty decent sandy soil, but with actually a good amount of gravel and rock. So all of this is just stuff that came up as we were digging. Waterwise and native plants love that sort of soil, great drainage, but kind of enough nutrient and water holding capacity. And so we just put all that rock to the side. The smaller gravels we put in 5-gallon buckets, or even smaller buckets from our plants. And so to get the bulk gravel of the smaller size to fill our trenches, that was more than we were going to pull out of the ground. And also we wanted that to be clean and just be able to put wheelbarrows and shovel loads into the ground. So we brought in some of that gravel to be delivered from the soil yard. But then to make it look a little bit more natural, then we started bringing back some of the other sizes of stone just from our site. And you can buy the other sizes of cobblestone as well if you don't have it, depending on your neighborhood. If that's kind of in your area, you might have neighbors with piles of it in their backyard. They'd be happy to get rid of and give to you. And so you can see just starting over time. And that's still in the wider dry stream bed. I still have a pile of rocks that eventually I will work in artistically and make look a little bit more natural. But that's always something that can happen later. Just hasn't become the highest priority on projects I need to do at home. So it's still a work in progress, even almost 2.5 years later. And so this is a close-up of the kind of gravel that we used. And for those of you who are in our local area, if you go to the website where you can download this presentation at cbwcd.org/presentations, you can also download our local landscape suppliers list, which has not only the local nurseries that you can buy Waterwise and native plants from, but also has suppliers and what they supply. So you can find the sources of where to get gravels and rocks. Just one quick tip wherever you are, definitely true for this area. Different suppliers of gravel and rock have different sizes of gravel and rock, and sometimes their prices for different things can be quite different, surprisingly. So definitely call around, and then you can always go to them and check things out in advance, and they're normally perfectly happy to give you a little baggie to get some samples if you want as well. And so you will continue to see, as we go into planting and other things, that space evolve. But now we are going to turn our attention to what you need to know about plants, other than just coming up with a nice planting design, which is something that we had talked about earlier. And then some point in time within the next half an hour or so, we will take a brief 5-minute break. So you can get a drink of water, refill your coffee, and all of that. So I don't see many new questions coming in. So hopefully that means that this all makes sense. But don't forget, type into the Q&A if you do have questions. So now we're going to talk about acquiring plants. So these days in our part of Southern California, the general nurseries are getting a little bit better. So, a place like Armstrong Garden Supply is getting better with Waterwise and even native plants. Occasionally, even at Home Depot, you'll see a Waterwise or native plant. However, you generally are going to want to go to a specialty nursery. The cost is not necessarily any more expensive when you go to those nurseries that specialize in that material, but what you often will get is plants that have been cared for better when they are there, because people know how to care for them, water them the right amount, not water them too much. And you will generally, if you go to a specialty nursery, be able to get much better advice from the people working there. So again, for our local area, even going into parts of like Los Angeles, you can check out our local landscape suppliers list. If you are in anywhere else in California and you're thinking about California native plants, you're going to want to, if you're wondering where to get native plants, check out calscape.org. Calscape is an awesome website with lots of great information. It's a project of the California Native Plant Society, who is definitely worth checking out as well. But it has good information about nurseries all across the state that carry California native plants. You might not always be able to find every plant you are looking for. And so you will have some choices if that's the case. call around to multiple nurseries. In most cases, you will not be able to find every plant you're looking for at just one nursery. That's just the way it goes. And especially, it's a great thing for those of us promoting the use of California native and Waterwise plants these days. But the last couple of years, demand has been very high, which is great because that means the nurseries can start growing more plant material in response to that demand. But some plants sell out very quickly because they're awesome plants. And so you might need to look and kind of check back over a few months, or you also might need to revise your design as necessary. And so if you feel like you need to finish kind of the planting plan within the next few weeks, you're not going to be going back to the nursery a whole bunch of times. That's fine. It's another really good reason to go to kind of the specialty nurseries that focus on that stuff, is because they are going to be more likely to be able to give you a good substitute recommendation, where a general nursery will absolutely give you a substitute recommendation, but oftentimes those recommendations are not good at all. So, for example, if you are around us, where we are, the California Botanic Garden located in Claremont has their Grow Native nursery that has now opened for the season because it's planting season again. Their staff there generally qualified to make some good plant recommendations if you need to make some different choices, substitutions, but the people at the local Home Depot will not be. What you're going to want to do is not get the biggest plant you can. And in fact, in general, selecting on the slightly smaller side, but the most healthy and vigorous looking plants you can get is going to be what you want to do. The largest plant, so say you have 3 1-gallon pots, there's a really big plant, a medium-sized plant, and a smaller plant. The really big one is probably sat in the pot for too long and is going to grow slower once you put it into the ground. Jumbo plants in a small pot are not a bargain. They are a bad deal. Unless you have a specific reason to plant a larger or a smaller plant, go with 1-gallon size plants. Those are the standard small pots, and normally you'll be paying sometimes as low as $10, but normally $12 to $13 for a Waterwise or native plant in a 1-gallon pot from a reputable nursery, from a grower that grows well. Unless you have a specific reason to put a larger pot in, just stick with a 1-gallon plant, especially for shrubs or smaller perennial plants. The 5-gallon plant a year later is going to be the same size as the 1-gallon plant, and it's going to cost 3 times as much, and you have to dig a bigger hole. Occasionally, for certain larger woody plants like trees, you can only find them in a 5-gallon or sometimes even a 15-gallon size. That's the only reason to go larger. These days, and more at the specialty native nurseries, you can find 4 or 6-inch plants, which are going to be much more cost effective. And they generally grow very well if you plant them in the fall, but just know that you're going to need to kind of keep an eye on them more. The reason being is that because they have such a smaller root mass, if we do get just like a one-day heat wave, they can dry out and get stressed out more quickly than a 1-gallon plant. So if you're going to be looking at things, willing to put the work in, especially for grasses and small, fast-growing things like that, you can do 4-inch plants, again, if you have a specific reason to do that. And ideally, for most people, most of the time, plan to purchase your plants immediately before planting, or if you can't do that, realize that you're going to need to care for them at home until you do. So the nice thing about getting all of your site preparation work out of the way, your irrigation system set up before you buy your plants, is that all your plants are going to be alive if you purchase them and then stick them right in the ground. And then hopefully they'll continue to be alive. If you buy your plants and then you're caring for them at your house for 3 months, and then you need to leave town for the weekend, and the person who was supposed to water your plants or check in on them didn't do a good job, and then some of them start dying, some of them will be overgrown, all that sort of stuff. You don't have as much control if you've been sitting on them for 3 months at home. So ideally, purchase immediately before planting. Occasionally for me, if there's a plant I've been keeping an eye out for and it's available, I'll jump on it and get just like 1 or 2 plants. But if you're doing a whole garden, don't bring a ton of stuff in. Even Waterwise plants need to be checked daily, especially in warm weather, and need to be cared for. So if you are going to be having the plants there for a number of weeks or whatever, here are some tips. If it's just a few days, you can just put them in the shade. If they're plants that want full sun, though, you can't keep them in the shade for too long because their growth is going to start to get a little funky. It's not ideal. You want to keep them happy. So generally for the plants that want full sun, if you can put them somewhere in your yard, that's one, near a hose, because you're going to need to water them. You don't want that to be a pain. And two, gets kind of morning sun, but gets some shade in the afternoon. That's going to help keep them ideally kind of at their best. If you just have a few 1-gallon pots and they're in full blasting sun all day, especially if it's kind of hot weather, you might need to water in the morning and in the evening. And it's a little bit easier for them to stress out because, we're not full-time nursery staff whose main priority is keeping the plants looking happy and healthy in life. So yeah, morning sun with some afternoon shade, even for full sun plants, is kind of ideal. And you want to check on them every day. Couple of tips. When you are first getting used to watering plants in pots, you're going to want to spot check and make sure that when you water, you have watered through the whole depth of the soil. So oftentimes I've seen that people who think they've watered their potted plants before they, when they're waiting to get planted they just kind of come through with a hose and wave it around and they think they've watered. But if you gently slide one of the plants out of the pot, sometimes you'll see that the water has only gone down like an inch. It hasn't been enough water. And so you do want to spot check if you're first kind of getting used to how much do you need to water, and make sure that the water has penetrated entirely through the root ball of that plant. Normally, what you're going to want to do is with a hose with an attachment is water and kind of fill up to that little rim almost each individual plant. And you might need to go back and do it a second time or potentially even a third time. That's just going to depend on the specifics of the potting soil. There's different soil mixes in the nursery industry. Normally twice we'll do it, occasionally once. And then as you kind of get to know the process, when your pot is kind of completely saturated, that root ball is completely saturated, pick it up and feel the weight. Over time, you can get used to understanding what it feels like, and then you can kind of just quickly pick things up instead of actually like looking at the root ball. And judging by the weight, you can kind of know if the root ball is completely saturated with water. And so finally, we have arrived at planting day. So the biggest thing I can say about planting day is do it right by setting yourself up for success. And so here are going to be like the 5 steps of what I consider a good planting day. First thing is the final field layout. This is when you are actually bringing all of your little 1-gallon plants and whatever other sizes you have out into the yard. You are putting them all down. You either want to do that, in most cases, early in the morning that you're going to be planting, or oftentimes I will do that late in the afternoon, like after the heat of the day is kind of gone, and have things ready to go the next morning. After you do your field layout, walk through and look at your plants. Take all the time you need to look things over. Actually, for most kind of people who casually do this, unless you are very confident with how you can eyeball things, measure the spaces in between plants and adjust as necessary. Realize that if your resources are telling you that the plant is going to get 6 feet wide, usually for a lot of our native plants, even just after a couple of years, it's going to be 6 feet wide. So don't put that plant 2 feet away from another shrub and just hope for the best. It's going to get overgrown and it'll kind of turn into a mess. That's one of the biggest mistakes I see kind of first-time gardeners making with planting plans and plant layout is too many plants too close together. After you plant, everything will look tiny and things will look bare. A few months later, it's going to be totally different. So give plants the space they are going to need to grow in. And that doesn't mean have a field of mulch and just like 2 plants that are 20 feet apart, 2 shrubs. We want nice kind of grown in landscapes over time, but you need to respect the space that the plants are going to need. They will be healthier, they will be more beautiful, and that will make things much lower maintenance over time to allow the plants to basically take their natural form. So look up how big the plant is going to get, and in most cases, actually measure it out. A lot of times people just like put things out, just really barely eyeball it, and things are too close together. So that's a big, big tip. And then do your best in your mind's eye to kind of imagine how things are going to grow in, how things are going to look. Like once you have this kind of semi-final field layout laid out, whether you're kind of doing it intuitively, or even if you're following like a formally drafted planting plan, walk yourself through and imagine what things are going to look like. Look at especially where the trees or large shrubs are going to be and think, should that be adjusted? Should that be moved 2 or 3 feet to the left? Should it be moved 2 or 3 feet to the right? One of the things that's very hard to anticipate with kind of design ahead of times is how is that going to look with the background landscape? So for example, my front yard faces north and I have a view of the San Gabriel Mountains over the tops of the other houses in the neighborhood and in between street trees and things like that. I wanted to preserve that view in my front yard. And so when I laid out my trees for my front yard, I'm definitely looking and I'm thinking, is that view going to be framed better in the top, that kind of borrowed landscape in the background by nudging my tree here or there? You can actually stand in multiple locations and look at how things are going to grow in. Even the best planting designers, the people who I really look up to and wish that I was half as talented as they are often out in the field on planting day, adjusting things as well. So don't feel like just because you have it in the plan, it needs to stay exactly there. Occasionally, I've changed things significantly from the original plan because I get things out and I realize, oh, it'll be way better if I kind of change it up like this. So yeah, think about it and go for it. And then once you are planting, dig a good hole. And I will show you exactly what that means. That doesn't mean you need to buy a lot of stuff. It doesn't mean you need a lot of fertilizer, but don't put a $12 plant in a $2 hole. Digging a good hole, planting it, not hurrying through the planting is one of the most important things you can do to get your plants going and successful. And then watering your plants in very well. The first day, as soon as you're getting your plants in, that first irrigation is the most important watering they will ever get and critical to getting those roots to start spreading out well for the plant not to stress during transplant, which is an important step in that plant eventually becoming a drought adapted or water-wise plant. So watering in, using as much water as you need to thoroughly soak things when you are watering in is critical. If it ends up being a kind of hot day, you don't ever want to plant during a heat wave. You can just hold back, reschedule if you need to. But if it does end up being warm, you might need to, plant one section, water that in, plant one section, water that in. Definitely if you have a full day of planting, by the time you're getting ready to think about breaking for lunch, water everything in and then proceed with the next part. And then you're definitely going to want to do some cleanup and touch up after all of that to kind of button everything down. And just, we're not talking much about design, but I just always need to say it, so critically important. All of this is part two. Part one is set yourself up for success by always focusing on selecting the right plant for the right place. So your first job is to make sure that the plants you are selecting are going to be adapted to the sun or shade you have, to the amount of space they need to grow in, to the soil, whether your plants need well-drained soil or are adapted to heavier clay soil if you have clay soil. All of that is number one. After that, good installation can help ensure success. But if you haven't selected the right plant for your space, you can plant it perfectly. You're still not going to necessarily be successful. And in our design classes, we talk a lot about how do you know that you are selecting the right plant for the right place and provide resources to help you do that. And so now we're going to look at some pictures again of the process moving on with the backyard. And so I've told you, ideally you are going to finish doing the hard work, like your dry stream beds and things like that before you plant. But then we hit the real world, which is planting season in my case, and a lot of work to do both inside and outside the house. So here's an example of us not doing what I just said you should do. So we had the water, the flooding situation, the getting water away from the house situation solved, but it was already January. And we wanted to get our plants in before, we were really going to miss out on the peak planting season. We're already, I like to get things in by early January. We wanted to go before any longer. I could always work on the rock work and stuff like that a little bit later. So here it is. This is our main tree next to the patio, this little 1-gallon pot. This is a California native desert willow. And so it's kind of hard to picture how that desert willow is going to grow in when just that tiny little pot is there. And so I am a fan of, also because it's fun, working with someone else. So this was my partner, Kira, taking this picture. And I stood there and acted like a tree, even though the tree would be bigger over time. It's kind of a large shrub that can be pruned into a small tree. And then she went around and looked at it from multiple directions to see, should the tree be a step to the left? Should it be a step to the right? Couldn't really be a step to the right because it was going to be perched right at the edge of the dry stream bed. Should it come forward? And then we switch spots, and then she stands there, and we do the same thing over again until we are both happy with where exactly this tree that's going to be kind of the focal point of this part of the landscape is going to be. And then we kind of go from there to, we don't do that for every single plant, but for the main trees, and if there's, large shrubs, whatever is going to be a real focal point, kind of think that through. And then doing the rest of the layout, measuring things out. If you know exactly kind of how big your step is, you can also kind of do that, especially for larger shrubs. But it's just easier kind of advice to say, just measure things out, make sure things have enough space, and then kind of walk through and take a look at it. And so, everything here looks pretty flat because there's these little 1-gallon pots, but we have trees, shrubs, and ground covers that are going to all grow in to be different levels. And then once you're happy with that, you move on to planting. Okay, we are back to talk about proper planting, and it's almost like got a question from Catherine with a request to talk about soil mixes and amendment, and it's like she knew what was coming next because that's what we're about to talk about. Talk about soil before we talk about how to actually plant things. So generally, with California native and Waterwise gardens, one of the many nice things about working with those plants is that if you are selecting the right plant for the right place, and that basically means if your plants need well-drained soil, you are going to want to make sure that you have loamy, sandy, gravelly, rocky soil, but not heavy clay soil. If you have heavy clay soil that drains slowly, you want to only work with plants that are adapted to clay soil for the most part. If you really, really want to grow some plant, you can make a raised bed and bring in some sandy loam topsoil from a soil yard and grow 1 or 2 plants. But other than that, there are so many great plants that can work with heavy clay soil. Just stick to the plants that are going to naturally work, because you are not going to change your soil type. You can have tiny, little influence, little things you can do, but you're never going to turn heavy clay soil into well-draining sandy soil. It's just not going to happen. Sometimes people ask me if they can mix sand into their soil. If they have clay soil, you never want to do that. You're going to spend a lot of effort, and you'll be making something that's going to perform a little bit more like concrete than it will like a nice sandy soil. You would need to add like 50%-ish, like whatever other kind of soil, and mix in to make it work. And that's just too much work and not worth it. So on our website that we have, they don't talk about a lot. We'll look at it later in terms of maintenance. I don't talk about a lot in terms of plant selection in this workshop, but in our design workshops we have a website called the Inland Valley Garden Planner. I'm going to type into the chat right now, Inland Valley Garden Planner.org. And then another website for California native plants that you might want to check out is calscape.org. Both of these websites, you can both search as well as the plant profiles have the kinds of soil that your plants are adapted to. And so you can use that and select appropriately. If you do that, for the most part, if you're working with native and Waterwise plants, when you plant, you don't need any soil amendments. You don't use any fertilizers. Our native and Waterwise plants don't need high fertility. No vitamin B12 or any of that other stuff when you're transplanting. You don't need any of that stuff. Put plants in the ground like I'm going to show you in the right time of the year. If you've selected the right plant for the right place, they're generally going to thrive. The only real exception to that would be if you have very heavy clay soil. You might mix up to 1/3 compost or quote planting mix in with the backfill. And so the backfill is the soil comes out of the hole, you put your plant in the hole, the backfill is what goes back in to surround your plant. And the reason for that is not actually to like make the soil richer right there. Because remember, you want your plants to grow out far into the garden and stretch out. And even, like a 4-foot wide native plant generally will have a root system that's going to go way farther out than the 4-foot edge. Like it was looking for its water and nutrients in a natural pattern is what you want. And so if you put a bunch of amendment or a bunch of fertilizer in the hole with the plant, you're creating like a hyper fertile little area right at the base of the plant where you will be incentivizing the roots of your plant to just stay put. And that's not what you want. You want your roots to grow out. And eventually they're going to need to adapt to the real world, which is everything outside of that hole. And so if you are amending your backfill, the reason why you're doing that with a little bit of compost is because your plant from the nursery, the potting soil it's growing into is basically just kind of like a specialized semi-compost mix. It's all organic. There's not real soil in it 99% of the time. And that's fine and reasonable. But when you put that pot into heavy clay soil in the ground, that's such a harsh transition in between the roots that have been growing in that potting soil and then hitting that heavy clay soil. And so by mixing in 1/3 compost or planting mix with the backfill, you're not making the soil too rich, but you're basically just creating kind of a transition zone. Occasionally, and this is like only a couple of times, I've had to plant in soils that are so gravelly that we need to do the same because it's just basically like mostly gravel sitting up against the pot of the potting soil when we put the plant into the ground. And there's not even good contact with like real soil. Like there's some real soil, but a lot of gravel. And we selected native plants that work well in gravelly soils for the site, but we need to get them transitioned. And so what we did in that case is we didn't use compost, but we brought in, it was like a 50% topsoil, 50% compost mix from the soil yard, mixed in about 1/3 of that, just so we can have better physical contact with the roots and not so that there's not like air gaps and spaces because of the texture of the gravel that the roots are going to have trouble growing out into. So it's just for that transition. That would be it. Couple of good questions came in, or I saw one good question came in from Lily. Over the years, she's added compost in her clay soil. Can she still plant native plants? Yes, absolutely. And if you do have heavy clay soil and you are very inclined to, you can add some compost on the top of the soil as well. I mean, compost can help loosen clay soil. It's not a bad thing to do. And just, a few applications of compost isn't going to have so many nutrients that things are going to go crazy. And the most important thing with compost is if you want to use some compost with heavy clay soils, with native plants, that's generally going to be okay. You just don't put it all in the hole. That compost will then lightly amend the entire soil area. So that will be okay. And adding that compost can help some. And that's more because it could help improve the soil structure some, not necessarily that the native plants are going to need the added nutrients or anything. So yeah, that's not going to be an issue, but you don't want to get crazy with the fertilizers or other amendments. And so that's a nice thing. It's a lot easier than growing roses or vegetables or things like that. Select the plant that's going to grow well in your area, and you're going to do all right. So here's just an example of planting a native perennial. This is a penstemon, California native penstemon, but similar to planting any 1 gallon native or Waterwise plant, or how I would plant just about any plant for the most part. And this is just in a random section of our garden to show planting a 1 gallon plant. So if your area is already mulched, peel back the mulch. You don't want to be getting wood chips into your planting hole. 1 or 2 little pieces of mulch fall in. That's not the end of the world, but you never want wood chips to be like a lot of it mixed in with your soil. As those wood chips break down, basically the soil microorganisms really like to break down wood chips if they're mixed into the soil, but they like it so much that they will actually lock up other nutrients in the soil as they are doing it, which can stunt your plants initially. And eventually, once they've broken down all that wood chip, their population will crash and those nutrients will be re-released, but that might not be for another year or 2. And so you don't want to stunt your plants by having wood chip mixed in. So pull all of that back. And if you've had your wood chips down for a little while, some of them might be dark and have started to break down, but you want to go down to where you find like actual soil. So this is an area where we had put down some cardboard as a weed barrier before we had put our wood chips down when we were first getting the area prepped for planting. And that had been down for a while. And so if you have your cardboard, what you want to do is you want to find that. And then you want to cut away an area that's as wide as your hole is going to be. So basically, it's going to be about twice the diameter of your 1 gallon pot. My favorite tool to do that is a tool called a hori-hori. I'll show this a little bit later and talk about it a little bit more, but it's a Japanese garden knife, and one end is serrated. It's not super sharp to where you can accidentally cut your hand, but it's great for slicing through that kind of wetted cardboard before it's fully broken down. You can also use like an old serrated steak knife or something like that as well. And so pulling that up, and you can see here are some of the weeds that have pretty much been smothered out. There wasn't actual turf here, but it was just a very weedy area that had never had a permanent purpose. Then you're going to dig your hole. You're going to want your hole to be, like I mentioned, about twice as wide as your plant pot, but just slightly less deep than your plant pot in most cases. No deeper than your plant pot, but in general, we want to plant our Waterwise and native plants just slightly higher than the soil around it. And if you're working in an area that's already kind of a finished garden and there is, whether it's wood chip mulch or gravel mulch or decomposed granite, I highly recommend having some sort of tub, a large bucket or something nearby for all that, or you could put like a tarp down. I really like these tubs. Sometimes you can find them in a local garden store. You can definitely buy them online. They used to be called tub trugs. I think the company's been sold. I think this is one of the companies called like Red now, but they're gardening tubs and they're flexible plastic. And so it makes it really easy to put the soil into it. And then because the plastic is kind of flexible at the top, you can kind of pour it back into the hole when you need to. For a long time, I thought that they weren't worth the cost. And then I actually bought one and now I swear by them. So dig your hole. And then you are going to kind of flatten out the soil in the bottom of the hole when you think it's about the right size, and then stick your pot in the hole. And so, like I said, in most cases, you're going to want your Waterwise or native plant to be just half an inch to an inch taller than the area around. If you have kind of moderate draining soil and you're trying to get by with a few plants that you think are maybe borderline, you can even go a little bit higher than that and just kind of mound the soil up to it so it's not sticking out of the ground. Because if your plants are going to have too much water sitting at the base of them, that's kind of one of the things that can make native plants prone to rot. And so part of the concept with planting high is that because all of the soil in this pot is potting soil, it's organic, it's going to kind of break down a little bit over time. If you plant exactly level with the soil and the soil in the pot kind of breaks down a little bit over time, the root crown, where the top of the roots meet the stems of the plant, could sink a little bit, and then it could be lower than the soil around to where that root crown will accumulate water. And once the plant is mature, that root crown wants to kind of stay dry and the roots want to get water a little bit farther out. So if you plant it just a half an inch to an inch tall, the idea is that even if the potting soil breaks up a little bit over time, it's never going to end up below the rest of the soil around it. And so that looks about right to me. And so from there, we are gently removing the plant from the pot. And then the easiest way to do that with a 1 gallon pot, you can kind of see how I've slid my hand over the soil. So I'm going to be gentle with it. I don't want the soil to fly all over the place when I turn it over. And so basically in between my 2 middle fingers is where the stems of the plant are coming out of. And then my hand can kind of hold that soil in as I invert it. And you can see I'm kind of gently squeezing the sides of the pot, depending on how rooted the plant is, how basically tight the plant is in the pot. Sometimes they'll slide right out. Sometimes you kind of need to squeeze the sides and gently remove it. And then there you go, checking out the roots. And that's kind of about perfect for a plant. It could have a few fewer roots. You need enough roots that it's going to hold together, but you don't want a lot of roots just kind of circling around and around and around the pot. That's never going to grow out well. That's called a root bound or a pot bound plant. And those roots will want to keep circling, or it would be major surgery to remove them all. From there, I am a big fan of really making sure that root ball is soaking wet. So taking a 5 gallon bucket filled with water and submerging that plant. And you have actually a couple of options for this. This is the way that I originally learned this and have done this for years. However, my partner, who is in some ways a little quicker than I am, just thought one day, well, occasionally when you do this, if the plant's not quite rooted in that much and you do this next step, you lose some of the soil into the pot. And so she just started, before it even gets removed, dipping the whole thing in the pot into that 5 gallon bucket. And it takes a little bit longer for that root ball to get saturated. But then when you pull it out, let it drain out just a little bit and gently tease it out, you're less likely to lose any of the soil. So you can do either of those approaches. If your soil is really nice and moist and you have freshly watered all of your plants, you can sometimes even skip that. But in general, I consider this the best practice, because if your soil is even just a little bit dry, it'll try to equalize the moisture with the potting soil, equalize the soil moisture with the moisture in the potting soil root ball. And so it can actually wick some of that water out of it. So starting with a fully saturated plant in a root ball just really gives it a little bit more of a buffer. So either way, you're soaking that. And when you soak it, you kind of see bubbles come up to the top. That's the air being released as those pore spaces in the soil are being filled with water. And when that stops, you pull it out. You kind of initially let it drain out some. And then for the vast majority of plants, one really good practice is to gently loosen the circling roots. So even though this plant isn't like too old or root bound, you can see there are a number of roots at the edge, and some of them are starting to circle. And this is, a perfect plant would be a few less roots than this, but even this is fine. Sometimes you can't always get things at the perfect stage, but if you just stick this right in the ground, some of these roots that are starting to circle will continue to just circle around this little root ball instead of growing out in its natural pattern. And so you can gently loosen things out. And sometimes you'll be removing little bits of it, but kind of resetting the natural pattern, kind of gently loosen the bottom as well. Sometimes the roots are coiling at the bottom. Occasionally, you'll just slice the whole bottom off if there's a lot of roots. And then and then the last thing before putting it down into the ground is, if you have especially any amount of clay in your soil, if you're just sand, you don't need to worry about this. But if you have any amount of clay in your soil, when you dig your hole, the action of the back of your shovel against the side of the hole can actually kind of align the clay particles and form a barrier that makes it harder for the little roots growing out of the plant to get in between those soil particles. And so you'll take either your shovel, or if I'm working with this hori garden knife, and just kind of stab and fracture the sides of the hole before you put the plant in. And that will create little micro openings that the roots can grow through when they're ready to start growing out. So put that plant in the hole, and then double check again. Sometimes after you've loosened the root some, especially if you had to loosen some on the bottom, you've lost a little bit of the height of that plant. And so double check again, make sure you're still slightly above the surrounding soil level. If you need to grab a little bit more soil and put another ½ inch or an inch of soil back in the bottom of the hole and lightly tap it down, you can do that. And then, so here's why I really like these tubs, is because it makes it very easy to just kind of gently fill the soil. Normally I'll fill it up about halfway, and then I will lightly, you're not really compacting it, but just lightly pushing down to settle out any air pockets. Continue on. Work that around the top. And you can see here how it's slightly mounded up to the top. So it's slightly high, and then it slightly mounds up. So you never want like the edges of your plant pot. You never want to expose roots at the edges. Occasionally, if it's a little too tall and you don't have enough soil, you'll water it, and then you'll re-expose kind of the shoulders of that root ball. If that's the case, don't worry about it. Just bring back a little bit more soil. If you don't have extra soil, you can always peel back some mulch and just slightly scrape up a little bit of soil from elsewhere in the garden and use it. And it's hard to see initially, but what I always do is you make a little ring with whatever soil is left, or sometimes just kind of scooping things up, so that you can water and have kind of this little kind of area fill up, so the water's not just running off. And so you can really soak it in well. And normally when I plant, like I mentioned, that first watering is the most important one that will ever happen. I will fill up this little water reservoir that I've made 3 times, minimum 2, but normally 3 times, for a few reasons. You want to make sure that the soil all around this hole is totally saturated, so that there's not going to be any stress, water stress in the root ball. The other thing is you really want to make sure you settle out any air pockets. So sometimes you'll come back and the soil will have sunk. There'll be a little kind of sinkhole, and you can fill that in. And there you go, watered in, ready to go. Now, if you are going to instantly be having a drip system or a spray system for your plants, then you can do just a very gentle kind of watering ring, or sometimes even just use the mulch just enough, because after that it's going to be watered by spray or drip irrigation. However, if you're going to be hand watering, I recommend that you keep that watering ring going for pretty much the first year as things start to root in. And then once it's really fully rooted in, you'll be watering with the sprinkler or hose on a trickle or something like that. And especially if you're adding this into an existing landscape, no matter what the irrigation system is. So if you're planting a new native plant into an established native landscape, and you might only be watering the landscape every 3 or 4 weeks in the summer, you're going to want to keep that watering ring there, because this little plant is going to want a good deep soak, generally about once a week through the first year. Watering 5-gallon buckets, it's very simple. It's pretty much the same thing, just larger. So here's an example from a fig tree, planting a little bit tall, soaking it. This fig tree had a kind of more roots than ideal, but I really wanted this variety, and this was the one I could find. So loosened it up. Fig trees are very tough, so they can take root disturbance. With some trees, if they're tough ones, they're not sensitive to root disturbance. If some of these roots are too long, kind of trim them up some, and then following the exact same procedure. Quick note, when it comes to California native plants, there are a few native plants that have very sensitive root systems. That's just the nature of the species or the genus of those plants. So if that's the case, you just make sure that you're not buying a root bound or overgrown plant. You stick it in the ground and you don't loosen the roots at all. So for native plants, that's mostly going to be manzanitas, hate root disturbance. Just don't buy an overgrown one. Don't loosen the roots. Just put that root ball into the ground. I do the same thing with ceanothus. They can be pretty picky with root disturbance. California lilacs Woolly blue curls is another one. Vermontodendron, for those of you who know native plants, is another one not to disturb the roots on. And that's mostly the kind of usual suspects where you just never want to disturb the roots. Just as another note for people who are into fruit trees, avocados happen to be the same way. Don't loosen avocado roots, just get a good plant and stick it in the ground. And so here is kind of a schematic just mentioning what I talked about. Roots a little, or the root ball is a little tall, soil mounds up to it, and then you create that watering ring. If you are planting trees, generally, I recommend plant your trees as small as possible. If you are planting a multi-trunk tree from a 1 gallon or a 5 gallon pot, you probably never need to stake it. But if you're planting a single trunk tree from a 5 gallon pot or a 15 gallon pot, what's going to happen is that that tree will have been being grown on a stake in the pot to be training it up straight at the nursery. And although you don't want to have trees on stakes any longer than you need to, if you just completely remove the stake, usually the first time we get like a strong Santa Ana wind, that thing might flop over, and you don't want to do that. And so proper staking for single trunk trees is often essential if you're not planting them from a 1 gallon pot. And so here is basically what proper staking looks like. Usually it's putting 2 tree stakes into the ground. You're going to need to use a post pounder, which is a heavy thing that lets you pound down on those tree stakes. And basically you set it up, as you can see on the right here, where the stakes in general are going to be parallel to the direction of the wind. And you're going to use, there's multiple different products or materials you can use for the tree tie, which is what ties the tree to the stake. But generally what you want to do is, as soon as you plant it, you want to remove the stake, the nursery stake that's in the root ball that came in the pot. And you want to do 2 loose figure 8s with whatever tree tie material that you're using, and then secure it to the post. And what that allows the tree to do is it allows it to move some in the wind, which is necessary for it to start to kind of establish its own strength. If it doesn't move around at all, if it's just tight onto a stake, then if it's just tied onto a stake, then it's never going to get the strength it needs to stand up well and resist the wind. So you need to kind of get it onto this other staking system, kind of proper tree staking, to let it start to move around some. And you want to have the attachment points be kind of as low on the tree as possible to still support it enough to not blow over, because the more movement without blowing over, kind of, the better. And that's what will make it stronger, faster. And ideally, you're not going to be leaving these stakes on for much more than a year after planting. But what you want to do is, before you actually remove the stakes, kind of loosen the tree tie material and give it a little bit of a shake and see. If you can see like a lot of soil movement, like you can kind of tell the roots are like lifting with a little bit of a shake, then it's not ready to come off the stakes yet. You can loop them back in. But if it seems pretty stable, then what I would do is I would remove these and keep an eye on it for a little bit. And then finally you can remove, or sometimes you just have to cut the stakes off, slightly below the soil surface. Good question came in. Should you call 811, which is dig alert, before digging and pounding stakes in? Yes, absolutely. And I'm sorry I didn't mention that. Normally I remembered to. Whether you're digging dry stream beds, pounding in tree stakes or anything like that, you call 811. It's a free service. They'll come out within 3 days and mark any utilities in the area. Definitely know before you do any of that. Oftentimes it's less of an issue in older construction, but in new construction, there are all sorts of things. And if you put a tree stake through a fiber optic line that serves your neighborhood, you will take the internet down for the whole neighborhood. I've heard of that happening for someone whose landscaper replaced a hedge with 15-gallon pots and didn't know that the fiber optic line was going through there. And so this is the young Palo Verde tree in my backyard, needed to be staked. And so you can see here's the stakes, but this is how low I did my tree ties. And this is just like a webbing tree tie material. There's all sorts of different things. I like this stuff. It's just easy to work with and it doesn't stretch. And so here are my 2 figure 8s, and pretty simple. And then one last note, if you are planting on a slope, all the same stuff applies, but sometimes what you need to do is you need to build a little bit taller of a mound on the downhill side so that you can do your hand watering. And this is a little bit less essential if you have like an overhead spray sprinkler system. Sometimes, you just water the best you can to water it in, and then make sure that you're really running that sprinkler system enough to soak everything. And you can also plant the plant on an angle, so your mound doesn't need to be as high. And then your ring, if you're planting on a slope, doesn't need to go all the way around because the backside of the slope is high. You just need enough of a mound or enough of a ring to be able to capture some water. So it's normally kind of more like a boomerang shape. Build those watering rings and water things in immediately. So here's kind of another example. So in our backyard where we didn't have a permanent irrigation system, you can kind of see all the watering rings filled at once because it had rained. That's kind of what things were looking like, even before we mulch and clean things up. If you are expecting weed regrowth, and again, if you have a lawn, you really want to make sure that the lawn is dead ahead of time. But if you're just expecting weeds to regrow, one way that you can help with some of that is just mulch in general does help, but doing what's called sheet mulching or cardboard mulching, we're using layered and also overlapping, just recycled cardboard that you can scavenge for free as a biodegradable weed barrier. So you're not getting that plastic webbing stuff that's going to turn into microplastic trash in your garden. Using this as the weed barrier will generally last, depending on your soil moisture, between 6 months and a year, which after that, if things are mulched and your plants are growing in, will keep the vast majority of weeds and weed seeds kind of permanently smothered. There's always some stuff that comes back that needs to be dealt with, but it really makes a huge difference. If you're going to do that, you want to water the whole area very deeply ahead of time, and then let the soil surface just dry out a little bit. So that deep watering might happen in sandy soil, 2 to 3 days before laying out the cardboard. In clay soil, it might even need to be 4 or 5 days. The whole soil area watered to at least a foot deep. Then when you can walk on the soil surface without making a muddy mess, you lay out the cardboard. You water the cardboard down well with the hose so it kind of all slumps down. It's not forming a moisture barrier. And then you cover with wood chips. We talk way more about this technique and show way more examples of it in our Removing Your Turf the Right Way online workshop, even if you're just using it for generally weedy areas. And so that's kind of the basics of planting. And so what I'm going to do now is kind of show you continuing construction just as a case study in this yard. And then we will move on at the end of the class to kind of the establishment section. Let's see if any more questions have come in. So question is, if you remove the stakes too early and things start to lean, what do you do? It depends. So some plants, like George's question was about a desert museum Palo Verde, those don't want to stand up straight over time anyways. They're actually better as a multi-trunk tree than as a single trunk tree. So you often see single trunk trees develop a little bit of a lean. I always like, if the tree falls over, it's kind of a goner. Some people pull them all the way up and try to get them to reroot, but I'm kind of always worried if it's going to be a large tree about safety over time. Those roots have been compromised. If the tree just leans some, look at the soil at the base of the tree. If the soil opposite the lean of the tree has mounded up a lot, like you can tell the roots have started to lift, then you really want to think carefully if it's better to just replant a new tree or try to restake it and keep an eye on it. If the tree has leaned some, but it's not severe and you don't see that mounding, the best practice, if it's going to be a large tree, is always talk to an arborist, because I don't want anyone to take my advice over this online workshop and have a specific situation not work out well with tree safety. However, if it just leans a little bit, if it's kind of a tree that wants to be a multi-trunk tree and you don't see that mounding in the soil, it's probably okay. Probably something that's going to happen eventually anyways. Do you leave the cardboard in place permanently, and will it attract roaches? You do leave the cardboard in place underneath that wood chip mulch layer, and it just acts as a temporary weed barrier. So it's going to totally break down compost, and a year later, you won't know it was ever there. And I have never had it attract roaches. The cardboard is instead of weed fabric, Leslie. The cardboard is a biodegradable weed fabric. And if you can't get a hold of the cardboard, if it's just for general weeds and it's not like turf, you can also use rolls of brown painter's paper from the hardware store. Although for a whole garden, the cost can add up and it doesn't last as long and it's not quite as effective as cardboard. Great questions. Okay, so continuing on. So here you can see the patio area, and now we are starting to work with our leftover broken concrete as well as stone to kind of form a terrace area. So our sunken infiltration basin, which we call our infiltration basin kind of meadow, you can see the meadow plants starting to be laid out, dug out the soil. We want to use that soil somewhere beneficially. So then we created kind of a grade break where we have a terrace, and then use the broken concrete to kind of make a little retaining wall. And then also a little bench where we can sit with our feet in the grass at this lower level. And so it created a much more dynamic garden space that feels like it's multiple levels instead of just the gentle slope that was existing before, kind of psychologically making it feel like more spaces. And then we planted a Western redbud tree here, which is starting to grow in, and shrubs and stuff to really even separate the space even more. This is Western meadow sedge, which is a lowish water native grass-like plant that spreads. It's very tough, but it can also take being fully inundated with water periodically in the winter. So it was a great little meadow plant for this. And so you can see it being built out, being planted, just working with rock on the site to also, instead of a slope, make these little flat areas better for watering, and kind of also looks a little interesting. And we had that rock to do something with. And so from planting, then we go into mulching. So what is mulch? If you want to hear me talk way too much about mulch, we have a compost where we talk about making compost in Mulch for Waterwise Gardens class, where we talk in minute detail about mulches and mulch selection. But here's the basic. Mulch is a term for anything that covers the soil, and it does some good things for our Waterwise gardens. It prevents evaporation of soil moisture. The sun directly beating down on bare soil can actually evaporate a lot of water out of the soils. As soon as you put down a mulch layer, and the mulch can be rocks, it can be decomposed granite, it could be wood chips, that stops that evaporation. It helps keep the soil cooler. And when we are watering our native plants in the summer, whether it's just once every 3 to 4 weeks to keep things from going dormant, or whether it's that once a week establishment first year of irrigation to get our plants rooted in, one of the main ways that people with good intentions kill native plants is too much water too consistently during hot weather, because our native plants come from areas where the moisture generally only comes in the cool season. Our true desert native plants, like from the Mojave Desert or the Colorado Desert, they get summer thunder showers, and so they're a little bit more adapted to get some water in the soil. But most of our native plants really aren't used to having hot soil and wet kind of feet, wet roots. And there are certain soil pathogens that other plants that are used to summer moisture aren't really a problem with, but can cause our native plants to kind of rot and die because they never needed to evolve in that situation of hot, wet soil. And so keeping soil temperatures down a little bit through mulching and not having the sun directly hit them can also help our plants through that first year a little bit when we're going to be watering them to get them established. But if it's 100 degrees outside, that shade of the soil and not having the sun hit it directly keeps those soils quite a bit cooler. And so if you are going to put mulch in general, you'll want to match your mulch type with the kind of planting you're doing. So if you're thinking of like a woodland type landscape, then until your woodland plants start having their own leaf litter mulch the area, wood chips is generally a good choice. If you have kind of chaparral or desert or kind of the combination, most of our general kind of go-to native plantings, then a mix of a light layer of wood chips, not super thick, but just like an inch or two, also mixed with some gravel and rock, not necessarily wall to wall, but here and there for a natural look, that's going to be often appropriate. And so what I often do for native and Waterwise gardens, especially my native plantings, is when I'm planting day one, because I'm spacing my plants appropriately and I'm planting small, which is the best thing to do for the plant growth and the plant health, there's a lot of space in between to be filled. And I don't want my garden to feel like wall-to-wall rock, and I don't want to invest in buying all of that rock and all the work in doing that when the plant canopies themselves a year later are going to be covering most of that soil area. And eventually, just with a little bit of leaf turnover, throughout the year, just the natural process, they're going to kind of start self-mulching. So what I'll often do is right after planting, I will just do like a 2-inch layer of wood chips just for establishment. And then as those plants grow in, they'll self-mulch. I'll also mix in a little bit of gravel and mulch in the areas that will continue to be, or gravel and rock in the areas that will continue to be open. And then after that, if I have like wood chips for my pathway areas in between the plants, I'll replace that. But I generally won't really need to be replacing the wood chip kind of around the plant areas because the plants will grow in. And then sometimes I'll kind of focus over time on in those gaps, a little bit of stone or gravel. Or plant cuttings as well. When you're pruning your plants, just kind of chopping them up some and using those to slightly replace the mulch layer in between. So here's kind of what we're talking about with wood chips. This was a huge load that we got delivered for the front yard or backyard. Our landscape suppliers list talks a lot about locally where you can get the different kinds of mulch materials. Here's what we might be talking about for gravel. If you're going to be working with gravel mulches, I think that this is a really nice example. This was a DIY project by someone in our community in Rancho Cucamonga, who obviously has a great eye. This was the first garden he built, but it's beautiful. And so gravel mulch tends to look very harsh and industrial if it's wall to wall, just the same type of mulch. And so the way to kind of make it work is to work with different sizes of gravel, oftentimes starting with a pretty small gravel, like a pea gravel size, or even smaller. There's a smaller size called bird's eye gravel, and then mixing in rock of different sizes to get kind of a natural effect. Over here, you can see he has decomposed granite mulch, but then also using some larger rocks to kind of tie it all together. I think that's just absolutely beautiful. Or here we just kind of started with wood chip mulch, and then over time mixed in more gravel and rock, as we had time to kind of work on the final touches in our garden. And I'm still in the process of doing that. So here it is, kind of, you can see here, just reality of weekend projects. We still haven't finished adding all the rock and doing the fine details on the dry stream bed, but gotten the plants in and mulched so that by May, things are starting to come along. And we worked in different phases. So that first year, we didn't really do anything right in this area. You can see we're slowly sheet mulching our pathways, got our planting areas done first because that was kind of the priority to get them into the planting season. And then still kind of working out the bridge area, but coming along. And so here is a year later, this area got planted a little bit later, but, starting to grow in. This is May 2019. September. So, you can see still hadn't finished the dry stream bed, but this is our 1-gallon desert willow plant, already becoming, a small tree, more like a shrub at this point in time, but, growth is on its way. So our shrub starting to grow in, and then kind of in October. So kind of like, I'd say a year and a half in is oftentimes when plants, gardens that are appropriately spaced, about a year and a half in is when they kind of start to feel like a garden. This is in the fall, so our wildflower seeds are, pretty dried out, but we left them in the garden because they become great bird feeders. Our meadow is a little patchy, but starting to grow in. You can see other little details that we started to work in as we've had extra little bits of gravel, that kind of mix of wood chip and gravel. Then, it was December before we were back and really starting to work in the dry stream bed to work that gravel in. And again, we had to do some finalizing work and on the slope around existing plants, but that was just the reality for our project schedule. You can see here, so here's the stepping stones now with the gravel in. Starting to work in some natural rock. And then by the April, the next year, so this is the second spring, things are really starting to pop. And so you can see some of our, like this redbud tree that we planted from a 1 gallon still has a lot of growing to do, but our meadows kind of growing in. Some of our shrubs are still not their full size, but they're starting to grow in. We sprinkled a few California poppies and wildflower seeds, some Clarkias in the open areas, which are great for pollinators, add color, fill the empty spaces. Have had time to work in some little details like this native Dudleya into our little rock wall. And things are starting to come along. Eventually working in to get more of that naturalistic look in the dry stream bed, letting some of the plants just kind of gently grow over the edges of the dry stream bed. And it's still very much a work in progress, but it's a lovely garden space. That next spring, we had wildflower seeds come up all in the cracks in between our patio area, which would be a bit much for some people, but we love to sit out there just among the pollinators and just kind of hang out and take it all in. And it truly is, if you build it, they will come with native gardens. We talk about this a lot more in our gardening for birds, butterflies, pollinators, backyard habitat workshop. I mean, it's amazing the transformation that happens in even a year, but especially over a couple of years. At this point, our whole house is a bird blind, and we just sit in our bedroom and watch the birds every single morning. And also in our laundry room that has a little window, we keep a pair of binoculars because we see the coolest bird action. And so, like I said, this is a realistic kind of, as I have time, DIY project, not a huge budget project. So you'll see, still little bits of the sheet mulch that took a while to get back around and work more rocks in. And, still, I try to take pretty pictures, but all the corners are not kind of done in the garden. But here, September 2020. So, started in spring of 2018. So September 2020, and the shrub areas have, they've grown in, they're full size. The trees are still growing in, but, it's become quite a lovely garden space. And it's always growing and always evolving. So we are going to end with more tips on the establishment period. And then I will have plenty of time to answer questions. So for the establishment, one of your main jobs, especially if you took out a lawn, is be on the lookout for any grass or weeds that start to aggressively grow back. If you had a Bermuda grass lawn, which is what we had in the front, you absolutely will get some coming back, no matter what technique you use, whether you're using organic techniques or use the nasty herbicides, some will come back, especially if it's growing along a paved area, because you'll have living roots underneath that will come back. So in most cases, if you had a lawn that came out, what I recommend is through the first year, especially in the warm season, try once a week to do weed patrol. Just walk through the landscape. You can do it, when you have a beer in the evening or a cup of coffee on a morning weekend. Walk through, enjoy your young garden, and just quickly dig out anything that's coming back when it's small. Because digging this out now is pretty easy. If you don't do anything about this for 6 weeks, it's going to be a lot more work. And you want to do everything you can to prevent this from getting into the root area of your new plants, where it's going to be a lot harder to dig out. Nut sedge, which is another one that often comes back. You might not know you have it because it's hard to see when it's in a lawn. But if you see this coming back, it can spread pretty rapidly. Pull it out as soon as you see it, and eventually you'll do well. If you need to, you can try to re-cardboard mulch some of these areas, but Bermuda grass, once it's at the top, can pretty easily grow out the edge of the cardboard and then grow back in. So really just digging it out is the best thing. And if you stay on top of it, generally what you find is the first year, you might not even have to do stuff every weekend, but it's a couple minutes, every weekend. By the second year, maybe it's every other week. By the third year, maybe it's less. There's always some ongoing weeding with the garden, but that work is much less tiresome. You get to be out in your garden that looks nice and often smells nice, and there's birds and butterflies around. Much better than having to push a lawnmower every weekend. And so a quick note on selecting the best plants at the nursery to set yourself up for success is select small, healthy, vigorous-looking plants, like we talked about. I'm just going to go through this quickly. We have another class coming up called selecting. We talk about planting again. It's basically selecting and planting California native and Waterwise plants, where we talk about this a lot. But the main thing is plant small. So this is at Home Depot. This is a good price for a 2-gallon penstemon, but you never need to plant a penstemon from 2 gallons. Plant it from a 1-gallon plant, and it will probably grow faster, live longer, and it will be cheaper. Of these 4 plants, this one on the right is the only one that I would buy. Even if you want these species, pass it over. These are overgrown. I will commonly at the nursery, if I'm wondering if a plant is a little overgrown, just carefully remove the plant from the pot. I've never had anyone in nursery get mad for me. If you see this, don't buy it. If you see that, don't buy it. If you see little white critters on the bottom, oftentimes that's something called root mealy. Don't buy it. Something like that. And roots can be different colors. This is kind of perfect. Enough roots to hold it together. It can be, even twice as many roots. Some roots are dark, some roots are white, but enough roots to hold it together, but not super dense is perfect. Don't buy it. Don't buy it. Don't buy it. Don't buy it. That's that. So for establishment is basically that early phase of a new planting when we transition our plants from a sheltered life in a pot at a nursery to a happy, healthy life in their new home. It's no set amount of time. It's based on a plant's growth, and different plants grow at different rates. So the best description I've heard, it's kind of when you take a look at your plants and you're like, oh my, that's grown quite a bit. That's kind of when things start to be established. Often it's about a year to 2 years, depending on the growth conditions, your soils, and how fast things going. Usually in inland Southern California, because we have enough heat, it's kind of a year to a year and a half. And so your biggest thing that's different for establishment is going to be watering. You're going to need to water more often. And you water to keep the root ball sufficiently moist without overwatering. When you do water, you water very deeply, and you water both where the roots currently are to keep that root ball wet, to keep that plant from getting stressed, and a little bit into where you want them to grow, to encourage them to continue to root. In general, over a garden with an irrigation system, in the first warm season, you want to apply 1/2 inch to about 1 inch of water once per week. 1 inch of water won't be terrible. Sometimes you can do a little bit less. And basically, that's like as if once a week you apply enough water so like it rained 1 inch last night, or 1/2 inch. And basically, to figure out 1 inch, 1/2 inch, water, dig in your soil some. Make sure that water has penetrated to like at least 1 foot. It could be after a couple of months. Depending on your soil and your plants, it could be less than once a week, depends on the weather. But in general, adjust from about once a week if you're planting in the fall. If you plant in the middle of summer, it might need to be more than once a week. But if you're planting in the fall in the right time, just as a default starting advice, about 1 inch of water. Or if you're hand watering plants for 1 gallon plant, maybe about 5 gallons of water per plant, once a week. Oftentimes, people don't water enough per plant during the establishment period. What we often find is people water not enough volume of water too often, which is the opposite of what the plants want. So once a week, but digging some, checking, making sure it's penetrated. So how do you apply 1 inch of water? Again, I'm going to go through this quickly because we talk about this a lot in other workshops. But essentially, you determine something called your precipitation rate for your irrigation setup. If you have a sprinkler system that's totally installed by the book, which we go through in our retrofitting turf irrigation systems, you can rely on charts from the manufacturer of your nozzle, but it's always better to do a quick test that I will show you how to do. If you do that inline drip system and you install it kind of using best practices, which we cover thoroughly in our other materials, you can actually look at a chart and you have your spacing in your emitters, you have your specific emitter, you have your spacing in between the lines, and you can literally figure it out. So for example, a very common setup for sandy soil is a 0.9 gallon per hour emitter. That's every 12 inches down the line that you buy, and you lay out those lines 18 inches apart. So per hour, it's basically almost 1 inch per hour. You would water about an hour, maybe a little less, depending on what you find out when you dig, about once a week through most of that first year. If you have any sort of spray system, whether it's a sprinkler system or whether you're doing it with a kind of hose attachment sprinkler, here's my method. Get a pack of, this is actually a typo on their website. It's a wide mouth mason jar. You can get a 12 pack of 8-ounce wide mouth mason jars. Oh, that's why I grabbed the picture of the wrong one. Sorry, it's pint jars. That's what's going on here. A wide mouth pint jar, mason jar pack, and you can get it pretty inexpensively. Locally, Target usually has them in stock. You can check on their website if they have them. But basically, because it's a glass cylinder and you can get a number of them. So it's like a super cheap rain gauge that you can temporarily put out in your garden. And then you can do a couple of things. If you're watering with the hose attachment, where you're going to be changing and kind of adjusting things, I actually take 2 or 3 of these and I put them out each time I water. So you can see there's one right there. There is one over there. And I keep an eye on it. If you memorize exactly how you have this thing set up, then you can kind of time how long it takes to accumulate an inch of water in this little, in these. And why I put it out 3 is because it's going to be a little bit different. So you figure it out on average. However, if you have like an in-ground system that's not changing at all, you can just do a test where you put out a bunch of them, you run it for a while, and you see how long does it take to run till you get that 1 inch of water. There's a lot of other tips and tricks that we have about how to do it, but that's the basic. Can make it pretty simple. And so for my hose attached irrigation system, I actually will go with a higher end. This is the sprinkler that I use. So this is a fan sprinkler system. Obviously, it costs quite a bit more than the fan sprinkler that you would get at the hardware store. This thing is meant for serious gardening. It's made in Germany. I've had these things that will last for like 7 years, out in the garden with no issues. And for basically the main irrigation system for my backyard, it's pretty cheap. And so that's the main thing I use. You can adjust it to all sorts of different sizes. Depending on how you have it adjusted, you're going to need to run it for a different amount of time. On our Inland Valley Garden Planner website, if you go to inlandvalleygardenplanner.org/how-long-to-water, whether you have drip or spray systems, we have a couple of little tests that will walk you through it. And I actually have a little online calculator that I program to where you can have a bunch of jars. You can put them into the calculator. It can help you figure out your runtime and all that sort of stuff. If you're watering by hand during your establishment period, plants here and there, a couple of tips. You're going to want to get a hose nozzle setup that's going to have a nice shower spray. What you don't want to do, especially if you have more than a few plants, is you don't want to use one of these things that clicks into 8 different patterns. Those are great for washing your car. But the problem is that on their shower spray pattern that looks a lot like this, it's really just one little ring of holes along the edge because all the other nozzles are on the inside. That takes you a lot longer to get your watering done than something like this, which to the outside looks like the same pattern of water. It's a nice shower spray, but it's releasing water through every one of these little holes over this whole surface. If you want to get like a commercial quality one, you're really into gardening, for a setup like this with the kind of indestructible nozzle and really like stuff that will last almost a lifetime, it could be like $60. But you can get a setup like this, which will do you perfectly well at the hardware store or the nursery for like $15. And those will do just fine for the kind of gardening that we are talking about. And so, yeah, make your life a lot easier. And then this extra little kind of wand part makes it a lot easier to kind of do your watering. If you are going to be hose watering or over time as your plants get established, leaving your plants at a trickle, I encourage you to find some way that's going to work for you to also meter how much water you are putting out if you want to have a Waterwise garden and really be kind of water conscious. And the reason why I say that, and I'm big on teaching this now, is because for a long time, I would, for some areas without a permanent irrigation system with my native plants, just leave a hose at a trickle once a month for a lot of my shrubs. And then I actually got a water meter and I saw how much water I was actually putting out when I did that sometimes. And I was shocked at how much water I was putting out, even though it was only once a month. And so here's my current setup. That is kind of my latest, greatest thing that I am testing. And it's working well so far, kind of a tentative recommendation, but it's not that expensive. And it could really help you keep track of your water use. It's two parts, both of which can be ordered online. It's a little kind of runs on a little battery water flow meter where you push a little button to turn it on and it will tell you how many gallons have gone out. And next to that is put on a little metal bubbler, which will kind of make all the water not go out into just one exact spot. You turn on your hose at a trickle and you can keep an eye on how many gallons have gone out. And then for how you like to set it up, how open your hose bib is, all of that, you can kind of also start to figure out your timing to apply the equivalent of that 1 inch of water. And that's mostly what we're doing is about 1 inch of water, a little bit less once a week the first year. And then as things get established, every 3 to 4 weeks for most native plants, about every 2 weeks for Mediterranean and general Waterwise plants, you're going to apply 1 inch of water. That kind of keeps it pretty simple for inland Southern California. On the coast or in other areas, could be a little bit less. But generally, it's not going to be up to 30, 40% less on the coast. But it kind of depends. And you can find, local kind of guidelines as well. So what I did is I did a bunch of math for you. So as your shrubs or trees grow in, if you want to apply 1 inch of water underneath that canopy, here's the width of the plant in diameter. So when your shrub is 5 feet wide, if you're watering underneath that canopy, to apply 1 inch of water, about 13 gallons of water is what it's going to take. And remember that the roots can go a little bit farther out. So what I would do is I wouldn't apply it all in one place. I would do, a few minutes in one area, then shift it and move it about 4 places or so. So I do like 13 to 15 gallons, knowing that the roots go a little bit farther. And so this is kind of a general guideline all the way up to how many gallons it's going to take to apply 1 inch of water underneath like a established oak tree. And then your main thing, just to kind of close about weeds, is stay on top of them. So this is my favorite weeding tool called a Hori Hori. You can buy it online. There's a lot of brands now. Here are 3 brands that all basically, I think it's the same company that actually manufactures them that look like this. This tool will last you a lifetime. Get the one made out of stainless steel, costs just a couple bucks more, and it's an awesome tool. If you have a lot of weeds and you need to clean up an area before you mulch, you can use something called a stirrup hoe as well. And then I'm going to kind of tell you, for those of you who want to download this presentation, there's other stuff here that you can use as a reference. And so what I have here is a guide, if you download the slides, to the kind of most identification of the most common weeds that you would find coming up in your new landscape, and then strategies for how to best remove them. There's also a little section on insect pests that talks about beneficial insects and identifying those. And then also the pest insects that you're most likely to find, and a little bit about what to do or not to bother doing about them. So we were not going to have time to really cover this, but if you want to download the slides, kind of a guide for that establishment and ongoing maintenance. Also kind of a guide, just if you want to look at them, are some tips about maintenance techniques and kind of pruning. But the main thing that I would recommend that you do to really get into pruning and the ongoing maintenance is we have an entire workshop about that. So just to conclude, before I would answer final questions and ask you to do a brief survey, is to really go more into the maintenance, check out on our YouTube page, cbwcd.org/YouTube. There is a maintenance and pruning workshop. And what that workshop does is that workshop gives you an introduction to all of the important main maintenance and pruning techniques you need to know. You can combine that with our, what I mentioned before, Inland Valley Garden Planner website. Here we have detailed profiles on the top 350 Waterwise and native plants for growing in Southern California. It's built for the Inland Valley, but these are going to be the top plants for kind of more coastal areas as well. We cover most things. For you native enthusiasts, we don't have every cultivar and species of manzanita, but we have a number of manzanitas, and the maintenance for manzanitas are all going to be pretty similar. So for example, just to use it as an example, so if you type in your plant name, and you can also find things through the plant finder. I must have misspelled it. Manzanita. There we go. So just for an example, so if you're wondering how to take care of your Lewis Edmonds manzanita, for every single plant profile we have, there is a maintenance section where we tell you what to do. The maintenance on these Waterwise and native plants is not rocket science, but there's a few important differences. Some plants don't like to be pruned much at all. Some plants like a light annual pruning. Some plants like a kind of a hard cutback, either once or every couple of years. So you need to know how much to cut. And then oftentimes plants will want to be cut right before their main growth spurt. And so oftentimes that's either going to be the spring or the fall. If you cut it back in the wrong season, it's sometimes going to sulk, or you might have just cut off all of the developing flower buds and lose all of your flowers for the year. So again, go through, and what you can do is I often encourage people, when you have your plant list after you've planted, use this information, copy and paste it into a file or something, make your own little plant guide. You can make a spring maintenance list and a fall maintenance list, or use this information creatively however you would like. And so with that, launch the slideshow really quickly again as we conclude. I am going to leave up, as we answer questions and do the final poll, just a couple of other resources from other organizations as well that have great resources related to horticulture and establishment of Waterwise and native plants. Especially if you're into native plants, I really recommend Tree of Life Nursery based in San Juan Capistrano. They do a month like this month in the garden, what you should be thinking about, garden advice all throughout the year. Here is the link on that. And that's a really cool feature that's written really nicely by Mike Evans, who runs Tree of Life Nursery. I make sure to read it every month. So that gets us through the presentation. And so to wrap up, I am going to launch a brief closing poll. This stuff is a lot of information that we try to synthesize down into a reasonably length workshop. And especially because we're teaching online right now and not in person, it's kind of tricky. So I really love your feedback in this closing poll of if whether or not this workshop worked for you. In addition to the poll, I love to get feedback in the chat. If there is something that I taught that you feel like is something that really cleared something up for you, or you know is going to be particularly helpful, I would love to know about it, because I will make sure to continue to teach that in the future. If there is something that you were hoping to learn in this workshop that I didn't cover, or something that wasn't clear or you felt was not useful, I would also love to hear that in the chat, because I always do read this. And before we reteach all these topics, we always do tweak things and try to improve it for the future. And like I mentioned, I think since this has been up for a little while, if people want it to go back to that, I could put it up in the chat. But like I mentioned, this will be, I will type in one more time. If you do want to download these slides into the chat, you can do that. I will make sure I have them up immediately after this workshop at cbwcd.org/workshops. cbwcd.org/presentations. So thank you everybody who joined us. It is 12:06 now. Thank you for staying these extra few minutes. What I'm going to do as people finish up the poll is I am going to launch into answering questions. And those of you who need to leave, go for it. And those of you who want to stay for more Q&A, I will go into that. Someone did mention that please click all of the workshop styles that you would attend at the end. There was an error, I guess, in how it got set up in Zoom. So you cannot click multiple choices. Don't worry about that, but thank you for letting me know. Okay, cool. So I am going to start answering questions. So someone asked the question related to that blue tub truck that was shown in the pictures. How big is it? That one I think that I showed, which was the medium-sized one, is I believe that's the 11-gallon one. For most cases, I would say buy the biggest one you can get. For some reason, I know that the whole industry of like plastics has had a lot of production delays and some things are sparse. There's a bigger size one than the one I showed. That's my favorite one, but they're often sold out and it's been hard to get them over the last year or so. So from Leslie, information for California native plants that are pet friendly. That's a good question. And if someone else is knowledgeable about native plants on the list, you can let me know. I mean, the main thing that you're going to need to keep in mind for most pets is just that there are not any toxic berries or anything. And there are great lists online. I believe the one that I normally refer to, I just kind of Google online for, pet toxicity related to plants. And there are some databases. I think ASPCA has the main database I've referred to, and it's pretty extensive. So I make sure that the plants aren't going to be toxic. And then the other thing is just depends on your particular animals. If people have like big rambunctious dogs that tend to kind of crash through and break plants, then working with ornamental grasses, like I would definitely have a lot of native deer grass in that garden because grasses are pretty resilient to kind of being tromped through. Grasses and kind of woody plants, but kind of the more herbaceous plants can sometimes, or like things with small kind of sensitive stems can kind of get kind of busted up. That would be my best kind of initial information. From Pamela, do I have to trim my meadow area? Yeah, I trim that, but only once a year to kind of keep things without not going too crazy, but still have that kind of natural look. About once a year to no more than twice a year is all you would need to do. So if you have a very small area, you can use just like sharp kind of those big scissors head shears. I happen to have and if that was the only area I had, even for something like that, that's just what I would do. Because my yard was big and very, very weedy when we first moved there, I have a electric string trimmer or weed whacker, which works great for that as well. I just hit all of that and then I rake it out. And then I use all of the clippings just as kind of the extra little mulch underneath my fruit trees. And then it just looks kind of like a trimmed kind of lumpy lawn, but it immediately starts growing back. Okay, let's go back to some of the earlier questions. I want to make sure I get to all of these. Okay, Lily had asked, what California native plant or hedgerow can replace a 50-foot privet hedge in clay soil? If you type in, Lily, back into the chat, how tall you want that to be, I can try to make a good recommendation. And also your other question for a Nandina replacement, also, if you can let me know about how big you want that to be, because Nandinas grow at all sorts of different sizes. Oftentimes they're cut back a lot to keep them small. And so if I know those trees, I can give you a good idea. For your other tree question, what tree can replace a camphor tree planted under power lines next to a patio in a west location in clay? Desert willow would be my first one, as long as like it's a taller power line, like 20 feet or so. So you have room for a tree. It just needs to stay small. I would definitely go with the desert willow as, at least looking for it for my first choice. Or at least, kind of looking it up. But I think that would be lovely. From Leslie, what do you think about rolled burlap for weeds under mulch? I have not used that because I've never had access to tons and tons of burlap for it. But some people have told me that they use burlap successfully. So yeah, I would say I would probably just look more online about it, to be honest. I don't have that experience, but I have had people who like work at a coffee shop or something that they just have access to tons of it, use it, and say it's worked well for them. So George asked about removing the tree stakes. Can you just, kind of cut them off at the top and then leave the bottom part in the ground to decompose over time? Yeah, definitely. And sometimes if they've been in there for a couple of years, sometimes you can just kind of push them and they'll kind of snap at the soil level. And then you just have, a part of a stake that you normally don't have enough point to reuse it as a tree stake, but you can do something with it. From Betty, my soil is, let's see if Betty is still here. Yeah, Betty, if my soil is extremely compacted and hard, what's the best way to start loosening it? So a couple of things, Betty. The first thing you want to do, and if your soil is extremely compacted, hard, and dry, it might take a while, but you want to get some moisture into your soil, which might mean if you don't have a sprinkler system there, doesn't need to be a fancy one, but just a cheap fan sprinkler from the hardware store. And you might only be able to run it for a little while because if it's very compacted and hard and dry, it might not absorb water, but run it for a little while and then let water soak in, run it for a little while, let the water soak in. You might need to do that for a few days. And the first reason to do that is because some of the soils in California, whether they're clay or even sand soil, might seem compacted when they're dry, but once they have moisture in them, they dig just fine. And it's actually just how the soil quality changes when it dries out. I've definitely had that experience. However, if it is truly compacted, it depends on the size of your area. This is something that sometimes I just have to do like one small area at a time, is working with a pick and just kind of breaking it up, which is a lot of kind of back-breaking work. You might want to hire someone to do it, but just loosening it up to the extent that you can, depending on the size and the budget. Like I have had commercial projects where we get an actual, like a mini excavator, kind of those mini bulldozers. We make sure we know exactly where all the utilities are. And then it's kind of like painting a floor, because you never want to get heavy equipment on soil after you've loosened it. And so we just work our way out. Then the other thing is I've had projects where there is just not much we can do. I mean, you're not going to, like with a small rototiller that you would rent from a hardware store, you're not going to get more than a few inches down, and it's almost not worth it sometimes. And so if there is not much else you can do, what I recommend sometimes is, depending on your soil, if you can afford to buy a little layer of compost, like put down 1 inch of compost, sometimes that can help bring biological activity back into the soil, help encourage earthworms to come back, even if you can't physically dig it. If you can physically dig it and mix it in, and it is very compact, just at the beginning to establish your garden might be worth it. Might bring up some new weed seeds. But in general, I don't love digging soil because it disturbs the soil biology. But if it's compacted, then you might not have much going on anyways. And mixing in just at the beginning and relieving some of that compaction can actually help. And that's helped me in projects before. If it's not viable to do that physical work, it's fine. I've had projects like that before. What you are going to want to do is, if you can, put up to 1 inch of compost on the top of the soil. Eventually, some soil life will help bring it back in. Working with wood chip mulch, even if eventually you might not have wood chip mulch on top of that, can help. Again, kind of breaks down, brings in some organic matter. And then also realizing that even if you have sandy soil, you might need to, if you have not great water absorption and infiltration, you might need to treat your soil like it is kind of clay if it doesn't drain well. And so you're going to want to select plants that are adapted to clay soil, plant them a little bit tall. And then another thing you can try is kind of using native wildflowers like an agricultural cover crop. So in agriculture, they sometimes use things called cover crops to improve the soil. That's what they're doing, whether it's through the action of the roots, the nutrients they accumulate, something like that. And so something that I'm a fan of doing in native gardens where the soil needs to be a little bit looser is I will get a big bag of California poppy seeds, and not right up against my new plants because they grow fast and I don't want them to outgrow my new plants, but in between, in open areas, or even a year ahead of my main planting, toss out California poppy seeds. And poppy seeds poppies, when they grow, have a taproot, it's almost like a little carrot. And the action of those growing, if you can get them to root in, and if you put out some compost and then toss the seeds right into the compost, generally they still will manage to root into the soil. That can also help loosen the soil a little bit as well. So that was a long answer, but hopefully something in there will be useful to you. Okay, I'm going to loop back around to Lily's question now, which was about the plant recommendations, the hedge to be at least 10 feet tall. uh, with some pruning to keep it not being too wide. My number one go-to for that tall hedge, which will give you a hedge probably about 15 feet tall with no pruning, would be toyon, native toyon. Can take a variety of different soils and will be in most gardens about 15 feet tall over time, but it grows to 6 feet tall really quickly. And they can be about 15 feet wide, but normally if you use them as a hedge, you'll plant them about 6 or 7 feet apart to get that hedge density. If you want something to be even taller than that, maxing out at like 25 feet tall, is Catalina Island cherry, which would be another one to look up, which can be a great tall hedge. And if you want something smaller than that, you can try California coffeeberry. That'll be about 8 to 10 feet tall. Those would be my first recommendations. For something to replace that Nandina, about an 8 foot tall and wide shrub, California coffeeberry would be my first go-to choice. A really solid, really beautiful, great habitat plant. Woody, looks good throughout the year, not fussy about soil, sunlight, or moisture. Great native shrub. There's a lot of dwarf varieties that are available, but just the normal species in most gardens is going to be about 8 to 10 feet over time. So those would be some of my kind of go-to choices. And then definitely you can, with the parameters that you need, like on the Inland Valley Garden Planner, there's a list of hedge plants, and you can also then search by clay soil. You can check that out, and then also definitely check out Calscape as well. Especially if you're not in inland Southern California, there's going to be some other good plants you can probably find. From Leslie, let's see if Leslie is still here. Leslie, what do you like best in wood type mulch? We've been directed away from shredded mulch due to ongoing fire danger and its potential to smolder and pick up in the wind. Okay, so if you are in a wildland inland interface area, the current best recommendations for fire danger is to not use any type of wood type mulch because they can all smolder and then pick up. They normally won't burst into flames, but especially if fire crews are like clearing areas and wanting to make sure that they're safe, they can be issues. And in a huge storm event, firestorm event, they could provide fuel. So most of the time, people now are moving towards, in those areas, gravel or decomposed granite type mulches, and then working with living plant material that can take some watering. So you can still work with native plants like on the slope area. You might need to do some like burlap or something like that to control erosion after planting, but not a thick layer of wood chip mulch. And then, working with, there are definitely lists around, and I think Theodore Payne Foundation just did a webinar about Firewise landscaping, working with native plants. But what you want to do basically is work with native or waterwise plants that don't have high water demands, but can take some summer water, which is going to be a lot of them, so basically you can keep them somewhat hydrated and keep some water content in their leaves and stems in the summer. From Lily, would I use mulch or rock for a water catch basin? It can be either way. A lot of people will default to using rock down in the catch basin areas because it kind of gets a nice natural look. And then you don't need to, a lot of times in urban areas as well, you don't have a lot of room to put a lot of plants down in there. And so if it's not going to be planted and you use mulch, it's just going to be a place for weeds to grow, where a 3-inch layer of gravel with some rock can generally prevent most of the weeds. And if you have weeds to start with, doing that sheet mulching technique at the beginning. That being said, if you're planning on integrating some plants, or you just want to do mulch, if it's better. I mean, I've had some where I'm doing a swale or an area to catch water off of a slope in the backyard of a place I'm renting. And both in terms of like, I want to do the project, but I'm not going to buy in a lot of gravel for it. I just did mulch in the bottom, and then I sprinkled some wildflower seeds in the bottom. And that is what it is. And in a big rain year, might be too much water for the wildflower seeds, but sometimes enough of it kind of finds the right little place to be. And then, for example, like in my lowest area that floods, where I have that sunken meadow area in my yard, definitely we used wood chip mulch, and which we just did the first year. And now that the meadow plants are growing in, we're never going to have to do that again. But it's just something to kind of cover the soil for the beginning. Okay, from Pamela. How much time annually do you think you might spend trimming any part of your landscape in my backyard? That's kind of hard to estimate. And just for like some context, not just individual plants, but my partner and I, like, because we're plant nerds, we have over 250 species and cultivars of California native plants in our yard, not to mention our fruit trees and vegetable gardens. Our vegetable garden takes the vast majority of time. Actual pruning of like the shrubs and stuff in our backyard, I mean, when we do it seasonally, it is a number of hours, but like in the summer, none to pretty much none. In the spring, I'd say like I would do maybe kind of focusing on it like one day of the weekend for 2 to 3 days of the weekend, kind of turning it kind of into a project in the spring for the shrubs that get planted in the spring. And then in the fall, I'm actually a little bit behind right now, but it'll probably, I've been working on projects in the garden, getting them ready, but I probably have, I don't know, maybe 2 days of pruning to do. It's not a ton. The biggest thing to keep things low maintenance is, again, that respecting the space it needs. So for example, if you have, for example, like a native sage that wants to get 6 to 8 feet wide, if you plant it in a space that only has like 4 feet of space, then you're going to have to be cutting it back a lot because it's going to be rambling over other things. If you put it in a space that has like 7 feet, you're only going to need to touch it like once a year in the fall to give it a cut back. Some people who want to keep the flowers going a lot more will do a little bit of a cleanup in the spring. I like to not do that cleanup and cut back in the spring because I like as many seeds as possible to ripen as bird food for the habitat value of my yard. Biggest thing is if you put the plant in the space that's going to fit, then your maintenance is going to be a lot less, and most native shrubs will need at most to be pruned once a year. Some plants like the native buckwheats might never need pruning at all. Okay, so probably can do about 10 more minutes of questions and answers. It's been a great Q&A period. Let's see, from George. Was your coast live oak in the lawn before lawn removal? If so, how did I put water back to the tree that it got used to take up from the lawn? No, that was actually a seedling that was growing in a pile of rocks. And we just kind of moved the rocks out, but the seedling had been in the ground. I don't know, there's something weird going on, but we removed all the rocks and the level was right that we could leave it. And we generally don't water it directly, but we're doing a little bit of watering to plants just outside the canopy. And that's been enough for it to be very, very happy. If you do remove a lawn, I guess to try to answer the question, if you do remove a lawn, your tree would then want to get generally watered, like if it's if it is an oak tree, like maybe about once a month, maybe a little bit more often at the beginning to transition it. Over time, wouldn't need water at all to like maybe in a dry year, water, little bit of water once a month, especially in the spring and fall, and then maybe not at all in the summer, or just once, every 6 to 8 weeks. So not much at all, but either it can be from the system that's going to water your new garden around it, or another thing that I will sometimes do that we do like in one area of our park where we don't have irrigation to the oak trees, if it's just seeming like we need to do a supplemental water, we have some soaker hoses, and we'll just like 50-foot soaker hoses, and we will just use the soaker hoses just out at the canopy of the tree, slightly beyond the canopy, slightly inside, and we'll run them for a number of hours to give a good deep soak uh, right around the edge of the canopy, which is where the tree wants to gather most of its water. So another question is, can I please talk a little bit more about digging with legs, not digging with your back? Yeah, so I would say the best thing to do, like this is one that is very easy to show when we teach classes in person, which I'm looking forward to us doing some classes in person here at the Waterwise Community Center in the new year out in our garden. But I would try to look up like proper digging online or digging ergonomics. I'm sure someone has created videos on it because it's a safety issue for landscape industry. But essentially, you want to keep your back straight, and you're almost, not fully like doing a squat, but you're using your leg muscles and your glutes. So you stick the shovel into the ground, and then you're kind of pulling down on the shovel a little bit by kind of squatting a little bit, and your back stays straight, and you're kind of hinging at your hip and squatting just a little bit as you pull down on the shovel. And then because you're kind of in a squat some, after you pull down on the shovel, you kind of just stand up with it. And then that's how you've kind of lifted. And then that's kind of the main technique, I would say. But yeah, try to look that up online. I'm sure you can probably find it. Okay, from Pamela, was asking if there is a contact information as you're working on a project where you might be able to contact me. What I'm going to do is I will share in our chat the best email to contact. And that's one that I get, but also another person on my team, Danny, who's very knowledgeable, gets. And that would be the best one. We're going to be able to get back to you as fast as possible with that. That being said, we have a lot going on and we get a lot of information. So I will not be able to get back to you like the next day. But hopefully like within a week or so, unfortunately. We get back as soon as we can. It just kind of depends. That kind of helping people with the random questions is something we love to do, but it's kind of like a triage kind of thing. The one thing I would say is if you are going to email me also with pictures that show what you are talking about. And like, I would say, if you think you need one picture, send me 3 pictures, from a little bit closer up, from farther out, because almost always, and you would know if it's a question relevant for pictures, but almost always my first response to an email with a question is send me some pictures. So if you start with the pictures, that makes it a lot easier. So the question is as a gopher barrier. So yes, if you have gophers, they do not go away by wishful thinking, and they can cause significant problems. What I highly recommend for gopher barriers is, so chicken wire does work to make a basket with chicken wire. However, that takes a long time. It's a lot of labor, and that stuff is sharp. And so there are a couple of companies now with different designs where you can just buy and you can order them online, and they ship kind of flat. There's different, things that they figured out how you can turn this flat thing that ships into a basket. But I recommend just if it's a little bit more expensive, but it saves so much time. And then because they're manufactured to already be a basket, they're better than at least the baskets I've ever been able to make. And so one of them, there's a few different designs, but ones that I've used successfully in the past are Diggers. Diggers is the brand. And so if you just Google that, I'm sure you'll find it. And so they are made out of, it's like chicken wire. They claim that their size of the holes is like in between the normal chicken wire sizes, and it's better for gophers and roots and the balance in between. I will say that I have used these, and then I've had occasion for digging up some trees that were a few years old that had been planted in gopher baskets. And so shrubs and smaller plants you plant in gopher baskets, get the appropriate size, no problem at all. If your tree is going to be a very tall tree over time, like an oak tree, think seriously about it, because when we did dig up those trees, and those trees, I was there when those trees were planted. I planted some of them myself, and these were fruit trees. And then we were evaluating different varieties of fruit trees for this area. And then we had decided, some of these aren't the best varieties, so we're removing them to do something else. And we planted them perfectly. And the manufacturers of the gopher baskets say that the holes are big enough that the roots can go out, that the baskets won't cause circling roots. And these were fruit trees that we actually planted bare roots. So I know for a fact that there were no circling roots in a pot or anything when they were planted. And what we did find when we dug them up is that the gopher baskets, some roots went straight out, but the gopher baskets did induce some circling roots. And in addition, even if you use the larger size gopher basket, if you think over time, like the size, like how big an oak tree is going to be, the base of that tree is going to be way bigger than that gopher basket. So if it's going to be a large tree like that, if it's going to be an oak, if it's going to be a sycamore, I would not recommend planting it in the basket, because you want to avoid the circling roots that can make, as the tree's starting to get tall, it not rooted in very well. And that wire is just going to be girdling roots and causing issues as that tree really does start to get larger. So basically what you would probably need to do is either plant a few oak trees and hope for the best for some of them. At least they get established. Once they're very well established, normally they can kind of hold their own, or look into trapping gophers. So from Leslie, are natives tolerant to gophers? No more or no less than most other plants. Question, can California coffeeberry be trained as a small tree, and is it deciduous? California coffeeberry is evergreen, and normally, they're not going to be more than 8 or 10 feet tall. But if you want to they take any kind of pruning you want. If you want them to be a hedge, they can be a hedge. If you want them to be like a very small tree, so you're kind of like pruning up the lower branches to reveal some of that branching structure, you absolutely can do that. It's going to be a little small for a tree, though. My favorite kind of large shrubs to turn into small trees that are going to be like 15 to maybe 20 feet are toyon, which is evergreen, and western redbud, which is deciduous. Okay, so from 3 more questions left. So from Pamela, would you consider your backyard low maintenance then? My whole backyard, no, because I have lots of vegetables and lots of fruit trees, and those are not low maintenance. The native areas of my backyard, for the most part, yes. Most of the year, I don't need to do anything, and most of the some individual plants don't need any maintenance other than an occasional watering. Some I cut back once a year. So, and then most of the actual maintenance that we do in the backyard is like, we also grow wildflowers among our plants, but then sometimes need to pull things out if there's too many wildflowers. We let things go like very wild. We have huge annual sunflowers and some other native plants that I wouldn't recommend for most people that are great habitat plants. They get huge, they're annuals, but they're like annual wildflowers that get 8 feet tall and become these great bird feeders as they start to dry out. But then, eventually they're overgrown and they need to be removed at the end of the season and kind of chopped up. So it's not low maintenance for me because I've built it that way, because again, those are my goals. My goal is to maximize habitat. I'm someone who identifies as a gardener. And if I'm not hiking, there's generally nothing I'd rather be doing than kind of puttering in my backyard on the weekend. I could have a backyard that has most of the shrubs and trees that I have. That's a native landscape that's designed to be low maintenance, and it would definitely be low maintenance. So again, it's all about your goals. And in the design class, we talk a lot about like, what are your goals? So for most homeowners that I work with, that they don't want to be a gardener. Like maybe they want a lovely native garden. Maybe they want that native garden to be really great at providing habitat for songbirds and butterflies, but they don't want to be out there doing a ton of work. Maybe they're going to do some seasonal maintenance, but want it to be low maintenance. That's great. You can set that as your goal and design a garden to be that way. We actually have some design templates on the Inland Valley Garden Planner website for simple backyard or simple yard landscapes that are like pre-coordinated selections. In that case, you probably want, for the average yard, between 10 and 20 different species of plants. Oftentimes for an average front yard or backyard, it'll be like 15-ish. just enough to get one or two different selections of trees, a variety of shrubs, maybe an ornamental grass, and some perennial plants that'll bloom throughout the year. It could be 5 different plants and still have great selected, native or water-wise plants to meet your goals. That definitely helps keep things low maintenance. I would not recommend you put 75 or 100 or 200 different kinds of plants, even if the individual plants are low maintenance, providing that balance of them having things, kind of grow it like that. That takes a lot of experience and still will require a little bit more work to maintain. Okay, I can do these last 3 questions and then we'll have to call it an afternoon. Okay, so from Lily, will strawberry tree marina grow in clay and how big will it get? I have not personally planted marina strawberry tree in clay. So I am going to look up what we put on the Inland Valley Garden Planner. I can't remember, honestly, if it grows well in clay or not. Most of the ones I know of are in more well-drained soil, although I have seen them in some beach communities where it's mostly clayier soil. Let's see. Oh, yeah, it can grow in clay, so that shouldn't be an issue. I would still plant it a little bit high, just a little bit in clay, so you never have water down at the roots like we talked about. And so here's the thing. I have seen, which is probably in clay soil in Santa Barbara area, there's a great nursery, a wholesale nursery that is oftentimes with some of these newer, what are considered newer plants, one of the first people to plant and sell it. And so at that nursery, there is a marina strawberry tree that's like almost as big as an oak tree. It's probably the oldest one I've ever seen. So over time, I have seen a marina strawberry tree that's 30 feet tall. They haven't been that widespread in the horticulture industry in Southern California for that long. So most of the ones that we see are smaller. I honestly don't know how prevalent those 30-foot tall marina strawberry trees are going to get, but I would put it somewhere where it's not going to be an issue if over many, many years it gets that tall. They're not very fast growers, so it's not going to be like they don't grow as fast as Palo Verdes. Like you're not going to turn around and see it that big. It's going to take many years, but it's going to be at least 20 feet tall over time. Okay, and thanks for George typed in that, yeah, Marina doesn't generally like clay in his experience, but he grows one in his heavy clay soil. So yeah, I think just making sure that after its establishment period, you don't water it too often, so the roots are able to dry out some in between waterings is going to be good. So it'll probably end up being like twice a month after it's established, and planting it a little tall will help. Okay, last couple of questions. Okay, so question about Catalpa tree, which I mentioned in a past workshop, so kind of a follow-up question. Difference between Catalpa and desert willow. Catalpa is actually a hybrid tree, and desert willow is one of its parents. So, and the other parent is not a California native tree. So in terms of how it can be used around here, it still shows up in, because one of its parents are native and it's a lovely tree, it still shows up in native plant nurseries and in native botanical gardens, like California Botanical Garden have some lovely ones at their entrance. Do I see bark splitting? I've never seen that as a main issue with Catalpa. I would use either. I would say my personal preference, if the space can work for either, is I think desert willow is a more lovely plant, and I think desert willow is more attractive throughout more of the year than Catalpa. However, Catalpa gets a little bit bigger usually, at least within whatever time frame, and it can be a little bit more like a tree. Like I love desert willow, and desert willow they both want to really be a big shrub. Desert willow can be pruned up as a tree, but to use it like as a true shade tree in a yard, desert willow is always going to be just a little bit small for that. Maybe you can get one bench underneath it. You can, But Chatalpa is going to be a little bit easier to prune up, like as a shade tree. For both of them, though, Chatalpa especially, like you'll see it in nursery sometimes sold as a single trunk tree, does not want to be a single trunk tree. They almost always will start to lean over because it wants to be a multi-trunk. So I would always recommend planting either as a multi-trunk. Chatalpa can sometimes have some issues with powdery mildew on the leaves, which desert willow doesn't. But it does have a broader leaf, which can also help it be a little bit more of a shade tree. So they're both great trees, though. Yeah. So hopefully that helps. If the space is right, I'd use either, but personally, I like desert willow a little bit more. Okay, and then last question, follow up from another workshop. I've talked about my compost pile before. Does my backyard attract rats? We have only seen one. It was either a mouse or a rat in our backyard. I don't think it's from my compost pile. It happened to be the same day that my neighbor was trimming the canopies or trimming the skirts of his palm trees, which rats love to live in. And we never saw it after that. We saw it kind of dash into an area where we have some like wood in the yard. And it was like, oh my God, I hope we're not getting rats. And I kind of looked all through it and moved stuff around and we didn't see them. So I think they were just passing through. Now, that being said, depending on your neighborhood, where you are, any kind of area with dense shrubs could attract rodents. But in my experience, native plantings are no more likely to do that than anything else. And yeah, has not been an issue for me. Okay, that is it. Wow, we did an extra 45 minutes of questions and we still have a bunch of people here. Thank you so much for all the great questions, everybody, and for joining us. And I hope you join us for future workshops, sign up for our newsletter, and check out our YouTube videos and the Inland Valley Garden Planner. Just another note also, as long as you're still here, I am in the finishing stages of creating what's going to end up being an 11-part video series walking you through designing your own landscape using the Inland Valley Garden Planner and using all of the new landscape design templates that we have created on the Inland Valley Garden Planner, really breaking down how do you use all of this information for yourself and use it to adapt it to a custom landscape plan drawn to scale on graph paper for your own yard. So that's going to be hopefully in the next 2 or 3 weeks that will go live on this website. So check back on the website for that and also sign up for our newsletter and you'll definitely get the announcement. So with that, have a great rest of your weekend, everybody. Happy fall planting. And yeah, check out our upcoming workshops that continue in this series to teach you everything that you need to know to have success getting going with Waterwise and native landscapes. And with that, I'll say goodbye, everyone.